Hey there, welcome. Whether you're nestled in bed with the day's weight slowly slipping off your shoulders, or maybe strolling under the soft glow of streetlights, I'm so glad you're here. This is a quiet, safe space where we'll drift back in time together and uncover some of history's most hidden, untold stories. But before we dive in, do me a favor, tap that like button, share the video with someone who loves a good story, and make sure you subscribe so you won't miss our next adventure tomorrow. And hey, leave a comment below. Let me know where you're tuning in from tonight and what time it is for you. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. Now let's get comfy and begin. Imagine, if you will, a morning in the year 1283. The air is still chilly, but the frost has finally left the ground, and the first shoots of life are beginning to break through the damp soil. You're standing in a small garden, just behind a timber-framed house. A man named Osrich kneels, his hands thick with mud, planting vegetables. These aren't the glossy, colorful veggies in the supermarket today. No, these are hardy crops. Simple, reliable food that could feed a family through the harshest seasons. Around him, a few plants are already taking root. Skirret, a pale, nutty root that would be boiled and mashed with whatever could be found around the garden. Nearby, his wife, Elswith, picks a handful of leaves from a plant called Good King Henry. It's a perennial harsh and coarse green, but it can be added to soups, making the simplest meal feel more fulfilling. This is how life was for many. Their meals were often the same, day in and day out. Simple, repetitive, but always a reminder of survival in a far less forgiving world than we can imagine today. And it's not just about eating. These gardens were a matter of life and death. A single storm could wash away a season's work. That's why the plants they chose to grow weren't about beauty or flavor. No, they were about resilience, about what would grow back year after year and feed them when everything else failed. But hold that thought. Just imagine for a moment. What would it feel like to rely on the garden's tough, unsung heroes to survive? Could you have made it? Would you have survived? Let's take a moment, reflect on that, and prepare for what's to come. Now that we've settled into the rhythm of the morning in 1283, let's step a little deeper into the world of Osrich and Elswith. Imagine the whisper of the breeze as it moves through the trees, the sound of birds gently waking up, and the rhythm of hands working in the soil, pulling weeds and preparing the garden for another season. But it's not just the serenity of nature that fills this space. It's the quiet understanding that every action here is part of a much larger struggle. A struggle for survival. Osric, with his rough hands, bends low to inspect the soil. His back aches from years of labor, but there's a satisfaction in it too. A satisfaction only someone who has lived through seasons of uncertainty can understand. He looks around at the garden that has become his lifeline, and it's clear that every inch of this space, every plant that grows, is the result of painstaking effort and determination. The vegetables they grow here aren't the glossy, perfect produce you might find in a modern grocery store. These vegetables are rugged, challenging, and built to survive the harshest conditions. Take skirret, for example, a slender, pale root that looks almost delicate, but when cooked, it has a sweet, nutty flavor. It's not the kind of food that makes you think of feasts or banquets, but it's reliable and steady, and for someone like Osrich, that's precisely what's needed. He pulls up a handful of the roots, his fingers slick with damp earth, and prepares them to boil, mash, or fry them into whatever they can make of them. Elswith, standing just a few feet away, checks the patch of Good King Henry, a hardy green that grows back year after year. The plant is coarse, not nearly as delicate as the greens we might find today, but it has a simple, down-to-earth strength. Elswith picks a handful of the leaves, her eyes scanning the patch for any signs of pests or disease. She hums softly to herself, a tune passed down through generations, as she carefully gathers the greens that will find their way into a soup later that day. She knows that every leaf counts. There's no room for waste. Every meal is a reminder of the resilience required to make it through another day. And then there's salsify, the long, pale root that almost seems to laugh in the face of the modern world. This plant, often called the oyster plant, doesn't taste like seafood, but its roots have a flavor between parsnip and hope. It's one of those vegetables that never gets the glory in the modern world, never makes it into glossy magazines or top-tier restaurant menus, but back then, it was gold. They would roast it, boil it, or even bake it into pies if they had enough flour. But even if they didn't, salsify could stretch a meal, make it go just a little further, and when food was scarce, that slight stretch could mean everything. These plants, skirret, good King Henry, and salsify, are the silent heroes of the medieval garden. They aren't glamorous, they don't come with a storybook charm, but they're resilient, dependable, and, above all, necessary. In a time when one bad storm could ruin a season of work, these crops were the anchors that kept families grounded. They weren't chosen for their beauty, but for their ability to feed a family in the harshest conditions. As Osrich and Elswith continue their work, they are joined by their daughter, Hiloa, a sharp-eyed girl of 14 or 15 with a quiet determination. She's been planting her garden nearby, a small patch with rows of plants marked out by sticks and string. Her mother thinks she should be helping with the turnips, but Hiloa is stubborn. She wants to try something different, something with a bit more character. She's traded a wooden spoon for seeds from a traveling merchant, rocket, lovage, and wormwood. Strange herbs, potent in scent and flavor, but Hiloa likes them. There's something about the boldness of rocket, with its peppery taste that makes your eyes water, that appeals to her. She's not interested in the safe, predictable vegetables that everyone else is growing. She wants to create something new that will surprise people. One day, a boy named Foki, who lives a few cottages down, comes by to see her garden. He watches her as she picks a handful of rocket leaves. Then she offers him a bit of flatbread with cheese and some rocket leaves on top. He hesitates initially, unsure of the strange new flavor, but when he bites into it, there's a moment of quiet enthusiasm. He likes it. A week later, he returns, not just curious, but with a basket of eggs from his family's chicken coop. It's a small gesture, but the beginning of something new, a connection forged over the simple act of sharing food. This is what the medieval world was about. It wasn't about grand gestures or lavish feasts, it was about survival, about finding small moments of joy amid hardship. Food was more than just sustenance. It was a way of connecting, sharing, and keeping hope alive when everything else felt uncertain. The plants in the garden weren't just there to feed the body, they were there to feed the soul, to provide comfort in the most unexpected ways. As the day drifts into the afternoon, the rhythm of work continues. Osrich wipes the sweat from his forehead, feeling the familiar ache in his back. But there's pride in his work. The garden looks good this year, the roots are strong, and he feels that quiet sense of optimism that comes with knowing that, just maybe, this season will be better than the last. The parsnips are looking promising too. They're a bit wild, a little more bitter than the ones we eat today, but there's an old saying that Osrich remembers. A parsnip picked before the frost is like a man kissed before shaving, best avoided. It always makes Elswith laugh, though not always out loud. The thought brings a small smile to Osrich's face as he looks over the patch of leeks, standing tall even in the cold, stubbornly defying the winter chill. As the evening approaches, the sun begins to set, casting a warm glow over the garden, and the day's work slowly ends. Osrich and Elswith stand together, their eyes meeting across the patch of land they've worked so hard to cultivate. It's not much, but it's enough. For now, it's enough. In this small garden, tucked behind a cottage, life continues quietly, steadily, and with a resilience that echoes through the centuries. The vegetables may have changed, but the need for survival, the reliance on the land, and the hope for a better tomorrow remain the same. And just like that, the story of Osrich, Elswith, and their daughter Hiloa becomes one of countless untold stories from the past. Quiet, unremarkable, but filled with the kind of resilience that shaped the world as we know it. In this quiet corner of history, survival was never guaranteed, but it was always possible. And that's what made the difference. As Osrich wipes the sweat from his brow, feeling the soreness in his joints, he stands tall momentarily, looking out over the garden. There's a deep sense of pride mixed with exhaustion in his eyes. His garden is his life, his family's life. It's the only thing between them and the world's harsh realities outside their little cottage. The frost may have left the ground, but survival is never guaranteed in a world like this. where seasons change swiftly and storms can wipe out a year's worth of work with one cruel strike. Yet at this moment, the garden is promising, the vegetables are thriving, and Osrich feels something resembling hope beginning to take root inside him. Elswith, ever practical, steps over to him, her hands still covered in the rich, dark soil of the Good King Henry patch she's been tending to all morning. Her eyes are sharp, scanning the garden for anything that might have slipped by. Her movements have a certain rhythm, a quiet determination that matches her husband's. She's not looking for perfection, she's looking for what's needed. And right now, what's needed is for these plants to flourish because these vegetables aren't just food, they're the thread that ties the family together. Without them, they would fall apart. The wind begins to pick up, swirling the autumn leaves around their feet as they survey the scene before them. Everything feels still, but in the quiet, there's a tension, a hum of energy that you can almost feel in your bones. This is the part of the season when you start to wonder if the coming winter will be kind or if it will turn cruel and take everything they've worked for. There's no real way to know, but the work continues. The garden waits for no one. Osrich turns to Elswith, his voice low but firm. "What do you think of this year's harvest?" he asks, wiping his hands on his trousers. Elswith gives a small, knowing smile. "It's better than last year," she replies, but there's a trace of uncertainty in her tone. "But the weather's been unpredictable, and you know as well as I do the first frost comes quicker than we think. These roots need to harden. We're going to need every last one." Osrich nods, his eyes narrowing slightly as he looks across the patch of land. It's not just about food anymore, it's about survival. The unpredictability of the seasons, the ever-looming possibility of famine or crop failure, it's all a constant weight pressing down on his shoulders. But in this garden he finds solace, even in the most minor things. The first shoots of skirret pushing through the damp earth, the tender leaves of Good King Henry, the promise of something to eat, no matter how simple. Further down the garden, the salsify, affectionately known as the oyster plant, grows almost on its own, stubborn and wild. It's not the most glamorous of vegetables, certainly not the kind of thing you'd see on a banquet table, but it's rugged, reliable, and precisely what they need. Osrich kneels beside it, his hands over the rough, long roots, their pale color stark against the dark soil. He digs carefully, making sure not to break them. These roots, like everything else here, are a lifeline. There's something oddly poetic about this vegetable. Osrich thinks as he pulls it from the ground with a satisfying tug. It's not the kind of plant that demands attention. It doesn't grow to be admired, yet it's precisely what a family needs to overcome tough times. In this garden, everything has a purpose, even the weeds and plants that never get the spotlight. Elswith walks over to where Osrich is working. She glances down at the salsify he's just harvested and raises an eyebrow. "Not glamorous, is it?" Osrich laughs softly, the sound rough but warm. "No," he says, "but it'll get us through. It always does." As the evening sun begins to sink lower in the sky, casting a warm golden glow across the garden, Hiloa, their daughter, walks up from her little patch of land. She's been busy with her small experiment, her garden within the garden. It's nothing like the steady rows her parents have planted. She's trying something new that doesn't fit into the predictable patterns of survival that have kept her family going for generations. She's planted rocket, love edge, wormwood, and herbs with strong scents and sharp flavors. Plants that may seem out of place in this humble garden, but have a character in Hiloa's eyes. They have something different to offer, something new. As she steps into the garden, she sees her parents working together, harvesting vegetables, and she feels a rush of pride. Her family's strength is quiet resilience and ability to make something from nothing. She doesn't need the lush crops or the ornate gardens of the rich. All she needs is the land beneath her feet and the knowledge passed down through generations. Hiloa is starting to see the world in a new way in her small, scrappy little patch of herbs. She wasn't sure what to expect the first time she offered Foki, the boy from down the lane, a piece of flatbread topped with her fresh rocket leaves. It was a bold move, offering something so different from the simple, reliable foods her family always grew. But when he tasted it, smiled, and said it was good, something clicked for Hiloa. She wasn't just growing food. She was developing a connection, a bridge between her family's world and something bigger. She didn't need to be like everyone else. She didn't need to follow tradition. She could carve out her own space, even in a garden built on survival, necessity, and the basics. Hiloa picks a few more rocket leaves, her hands gentle as she caresses the sharp green leaves. It's not an easy plant to love. It's bold, it's strong, it can be overwhelming. But that's the point. It's about making something out of nothing, bringing flavor to a life that's often too plain and predictable. As she hands the leaves to her mother, she's not just offering them as food, she's offering her family something else, something more. It's her way of saying that survival doesn't have to mean giving up on what makes life special. She can be part of this tradition, this rhythm of survival, but she doesn't have to be bound by it. She can bring something new to the table, something unexpected. Elswith looks at the rocket, then at her daughter, her expression thoughtful. She can see the spark in Hiloa's eyes, the same spark she used to see in her own when she was younger, that spark of curiosity, of rebellion, of hope. It's a small thing, but it's a powerful one. In this garden, in this life, it's the small things that make all the difference. Every leaf, every root, every plant, no matter how small, contributes to something bigger, and that's the beauty of it all. Though humble, the garden holds the power to connect, heal, and bring new life into the world, even when everything else seems to be fading. It's not just the vegetables that feed the family. It's the hope, the resilience, and the love that goes into every seed, every plant, and every harvest. It's a quiet kind of magic that's easy to overlook in the rush of modern life, but essential for survival in a world as unpredictable and wild as this one. As the sun dips below the horizon, the garden is bathed in the soft glow of twilight, and the day's work slowly winds down. Side by side, Osrich and Elswith know that tomorrow will bring new challenges and worries, but for now, they have this garden, this family, this quiet, resilient strength that has always carried them through. And in this quiet moment, as the stars begin to appear overhead, they realize that despite the hardships, despite the struggles, they've made it, together, and that's all that matters. As the darkness of night begins to settle over the garden, Osrich and Elswith find themselves sitting side by side, hands resting in their laps, taking a brief respite from the day's work. The evening air is cooler now, and the garden, once alive with the sounds of hands working the soil, now lies quiet. The first stars are beginning to twinkle overhead, a gentle reminder that time moves, whether you're ready for it or not. Osrich looks out across the garden, the vegetables they've planted casting long shadows in the dimming light. They've done the hard work today, and it feels like a small victory. But the fear still lingers, hanging over them like a storm cloud. Tomorrow might bring a different story. The plants might wither under the frost, or the rain might come and ruin the crops they've worked so hard for. It's a reality they live with every day. Elswith, too, feels that quiet unease. The work never truly ends. There's always more to be done. Another patch to tend, another root to pull, another season to prepare for. Yet, despite the exhaustion settling in her bones, she can't help but feel of something more profound, a feeling of pride in what they've built together, what they've managed to make out of nothing. But the peace is fleeting. In the distance, the wind begins to pick up again, rustling the branches of the trees surrounding their small plot of land. Osrich's eyes narrow, sensing the shift. "The storm's coming," he mutters under his breath. It's not a prediction, not something that can be easily read from the sky, but something he's learned to feel, an instinct honed over years of surviving in a world that constantly shifts beneath their feet. "Do you think it will be bad?" Elswith asks, her voice steady, but there's a hint of worry that she can't quite hide. She knows the answer, even before Osrich speaks it. A bad storm now could ruin everything. "We can only wait and see," he says, a sigh escaping his lips, "but we've made it through worse." There's comfort in those words, even if they don't quite settle the unease in his chest. They've always made it through, but there's always that lingering question. How long can they keep doing this? Elswith stands, brushing the dirt from her hands, and walks over to a patch of leeks growing steadily through the season. She knows that these will be the last vegetables to survive the winter once the frost hits. The leeks stand tall and proud, their long, pale leaves swaying gently in the wind. They've been a symbol of resilience for the people of this land for generations. Elswith's grandmother used to say that the leek was a gift from the earth, always there, consistently strong, even when everything else had withered. Hiloa, their daughter, steps out of the cottage just as Elswith pulls the last leek from the soil. The girl is quiet, as she always is when she's deep in thought, but there's something different in her eyes tonight. The storm is on her mind too, though it's not the weather she's thinking about. It's the work done in the garden, the plants she's grown, the herbs she's carefully tended to. She's grown fond of her little corner of the world, even if it's not how her parents would have done it. "I think we're ready for the storm," Hiloa says softly, her voice carrying the weight of someone who has spent too many hours in the garden herself, watching the earth shift and change. She may only be a child, but a wisdom in her seems older than her years. The garden has taught her that everything is temporary and in flux, and there's only so much you can control. Osrich looks at his daughter, his brow furrowing slightly. "What do you mean, Hiloa?" he asks, his voice full of concern that only a father can feel. "I mean," she pauses, choosing her words carefully, "we've done all we can. We've planted, we've tended, we've prepared. There's nothing else to do now but wait." Her words hang in the air, heavier than the impending storm. They've worked hard and sacrificed, but it's true. Now all they can do is wait and hope that the weather doesn't betray them. Elswith walks over to her daughter, placing a hand on her shoulder, her voice soft. "You've learned well, Hiloa. You've worked hard, and that's all we can do in this world." Her gaze lingers on the garden and the plants they've nurtured, and she smiles with a quiet, knowing smile. "But remember, life's not just about what you grow. It's about caring for what's already in front of you." Hiloa nods, understanding more than her mother realizes. She's spent so much time focusing on her little herbs, the rocket, the lovage, the wormwood, that she hasn't stopped thinking about the bigger picture. She has been looking for something new, something different, but perhaps, in doing so, she's forgotten that there's power in the traditions that came before her. The wind begins to howl as the storm picks up speed, the first raindrops splattering against the ground like tiny bursts of energy, signaling the start of something much larger. Osric grabs his spade and looks toward the horizon. "We need to secure the roof," he says, urgency in his voice. "If this storm's as bad as it seems, we won't have much time to prepare everything." Elswith and Hiloa jump into action, heading inside to gather the necessary tools. As they work, the storm intensifies, the wind howling louder, the rain coming down in sheets. The little house groans under the weight of the weather, but the family is determined. Together, they work quickly to patch up the roof, reinforce the walls, and protect the garden as best as possible. It's not a guarantee, but it's all they can do. The storm rages through the night, the wind howling like a beast, the rain beating against the cottage with a deafening roar. But amid it all, the family holds firm, huddled together in the warmth of their small home. They don't have much, but they have each other, and in a world where everything else is uncertain, that's the one thing they can rely on. As the storm finally begins to subside and the first rays of sunlight creep through the cracks in the cottage, Osrich steps outside. The garden is a mess. The wind has battered some plants. Others are standing firm, their roots firmly entrenched in the soil. Osrich surveys the damage, his heart pounding with relief and uncertainty. The storm has passed, but the real question is, what comes next? Elswith joins him, standing silently by his side. They both know that they've done their part, no matter what happens in the days ahead. They've worked the land, cared for it, and made it through another storm together. And that's enough. For now, it's enough. In the end, that's the truth of it all. Survival isn't just about what you can control. It's about how you weather the storms, face the challenges, and keep going, even when it feels like everything is falling apart. It's about holding on, keeping your roots deep, and remembering that no matter how hard the winds blow, there's always the promise of a new day. The night had been long and the storm had done its worst, but as the first light of morning crept through the darkened sky, there was a shift in the air, a calm as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for the aftermath. Osrich stepped outside first, his boots sinking into the soft, damp earth as he walked across the garden. The storm had passed, but its effects were now apparent. The winds had ripped through the plants, torn up roots, and battered the fragile shoots they'd worked so hard to cultivate. It was a mess. There was no other way to describe it. But Osrich had lived through worse. The weather had always been unpredictable, always harsh. Yet each time he had managed to hold on, keep going, and survive. He wasn't about to let this storm take that away from him. Not today. Elswith followed closely behind, her face a mask of quiet determination, the kind of determination from years of hard labor and knowing that the world doesn't stop, even when needed. She didn't speak at first. There was no need. They both knew what needed to be done. The garden was their livelihood, their safety net, and despite the damage, there was still hope. Hope that the roots will hold, that the plants will survive, and that they can rebuild. The first thing Osrich noticed as he surveyed the damage was the skirret. It had been one of their most reliable crops, a root vegetable that had stood the test of time, but now its slender, pale stalks were half buried in the mud, uprooted by the wind. He knelt, his hands rough as they sifted through the dirt, trying to find what was left of it. The wind had done its damage, but the root had a stubbornness that Osrich had come to rely on. No matter how often it had been pulled from the earth, it seemed to find its way back. "Not gone yet," he muttered, pulling a few strands of the root free. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give him hope. Elswith joined him, her eyes scanning the garden, her gaze sharp. "It's not perfect, but it's something," she said, her voice steady, though there was a hint of frustration there too. She had spent hours tending to this garden, nurturing it from seed to sprout, and now, in the span of one night, it had been thrown into disarray. Yet, as always, she knew this was part of the deal. There was no such thing as an easy year, no such thing as a flawless harvest. They moved on, checking the other crops. Good King Henry, the sturdy green that had been a staple in their meals, was bent low, its leaves now sagging under the weight of the rain. The leeks, which had always been a symbol of resilience, were still standing, though they swayed in the wind like a flag caught in a storm. Salsify, the oyster plant, as they sometimes called it, had been nearly torn apart, its roots tangled and broken. "It's a lot worse than I thought," Osrich said, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. The storm had left its mark, but it wasn't all bad news. There was still enough left to rebuild. It's still enough to salvage. Elswith walked over to the leeks, bending down to inspect them. "These will survive," she said, her voice softer now. "They always do." Osrich nodded, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the horizon. "We'll have to replant some of it," he said, "but I think we'll be okay. We've been through worse storms." Elswith gave a small smile, her fingers brushing the leeks, her touch gentle. "We've always made it through." But Hiloa, who had been watching quietly from the edge of the garden, stepped forward, her eyes wide with concern. "Are we going to be all right?" she asked, her voice uncertain, the weight of the situation pressing down on her shoulders. Osrich looked at her, his face softening. "We'll be fine," he said. "We always find a way." But Hiloa wasn't sure. The storm had shaken something inside of her. She had always known the world could be harsh and the garden unpredictable. But this was different. This wasn't just another storm. This felt like something bigger, something that could change everything. She turned her gaze back to the garden, the mess of uprooted plants, the broken stalks, the muddy soil. The work ahead seemed daunting, and for the first time, she wasn't sure they could rebuild it. It felt like too much, like they had already given so much, and yet the storm had still taken so much from them. Elswith seemed to sense her unease. She walked over to her daughter, placing a hand on her shoulder. "It's all right to feel uncertain," she said softly. "But you know this land. You know how to work it. And we'll work it together. There's nothing we can't rebuild when we're together." Hiloa looked up at her mother, her heart heavy but full of determination. "I know," she said, her voice steadier now. "I'll help. We'll fix it. We'll make it better." The three of them worked together for the rest of the morning. Osrich and Elswith focused on the garden, replanting what they could, pulling up the damaged plants and salvaging the roots that had survived the storm. Hiloa worked alongside them, with her hands moving with a newfound purpose as she repaired the small patch of herbs she had been tending. The rocket and lovad she had planted weren't as strong as the traditional crops her parents grew, but there was something powerful about them. They were a part of her, a way of contributing to something larger than herself. They might not have been as sturdy, but they were hers. And in a world where so much could be taken away, there was strength in that. As the day wore on, the garden slowly began to retake shape. The wind had died down, and the storm's remnants had faded into the distance. The air was still damp, but the promise of new life began to fill the space where destruction had once reigned. The plants, though battered, weren't gone. They hadn't been defeated. They would continue to grow, just as they always had. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. Later that afternoon, as they gathered inside for a simple meal made from what they could salvage, the storm's fury now a memory, Osrich looked at his family. He could see the same fire in their eyes that he had always seen in his own. The world may have been unpredictable, but they would face it together, one season at a time. "We've been through a lot," he said quietly, his voice rough but filled with pride. "But we're still here, and we'll keep going, no matter what." Elswith smiled, her eyes soft. "We always do." And Hiloa, sitting between them, felt something stir inside her. They need quiet confidence and knowledge that no matter what happens, they will be okay. They always found a way. And as long as they worked together and held on to the land, they would always find a way. The storm had come and gone, but the strength of their family, the strength of the garden, would always remain. In the end, that's what it came down to. Survival wasn't about the storms you faced, but how you rebuilt after them. You stood tall, no matter the damage, and kept moving forward. And that, she realized, was the real power of the garden. It wasn't just the plants that grew, the people, the resilience, the strength to start again, no matter what the world threw at them. The storm was gone, but the scars it left behind weren't. Osrich stood at the garden's edge, his boots sinking into the soft, muddied earth as he scanned the area. His eyes narrowed against the faint rays of the sun, tracing over the wreckage. The once immaculate rows of leeks, the sturdy stalks of the skirret, and even the wild, rugged salsify now lay in disarray. Some plants had been torn from the ground entirely. Others were bent low, their leaves crushed by the storm's fury. But as he looked closer, he saw that life wasn't gone. It never truly was. Elswith stood beside him, her face set in the familiar mask of quiet determination. She didn't say anything at first, her eyes scanning the mess, her thoughts racing. The work had been hard enough without nature's intervention, but now it felt like they were starting over, like the past few months of effort had been undone in one violent sweep. But she knew better than to complain. There was no use in it. Complaining wouldn't bring the crops back. Hard work, patience, and resilience were what would pull them through. "We can fix this," Osrich said quietly, as though speaking to the land itself. It wasn't a question. He had said it more to himself than to Elswith. "We'll have to start over in some places, but we can do it." Elswith nodded slowly, her gaze never leaving the garden. "We always do," she said, her voice calm but carrying the weight of years of experience. But the uncertainty lingered. How many seasons had they survived already? How many more storms would they have to endure? This time, something felt different. There was a bite to the wind, a sharpness to the air that didn't feel like the usual summer storm. This felt like a turning point, a warning. The two began to work, but this time with a new sense of urgency. The damage was apparent, but it wasn't the end. Not yet. Osrich began digging through the soil, careful not to tear the remaining roots out roughly. The skirret was salvageable, not much of it, but enough. He pulled a few strands from the damp ground and set them aside, already planning to replant them in a new spot away from the wind's reach. Elswith was already at work with the salsify, her hands moving with practiced ease as she separated the broken roots from the earth. She paused for a moment, her eyes searching the ground. "It's not all gone," she said, almost as though reassuring herself. "There's still enough here to work with." Osrich glanced at her, then at the mess around them. "It's not about what's lost," he said, his voice resolute. "It's about what we can save." Hiloa came up from behind, her petite figure barely visible against the landscape of destruction. She had seen the storm's aftermath from the window, and now, her heart heavy with concern, she approached the garden with tentative steps. Her patch of herbs, the rocket, the lovage, the wormwood, had been obliterated, their once proud leaves now nothing more than shredded fragments scattered across the ground. At first, she was paralyzed. The plants she had so carefully nurtured, so thoughtfully tended to, were gone. Her vision for the garden, the small space she had carved out as her own, was ruined. She couldn't bring herself to look at it, at the pieces of it that lay discarded in the muck. But then, something inside her clicked. She remembered what her mother had told her repeatedly. There was always something to salvage. Always. The earth was never completely barren, not if you knew where to look, and Hiloa was learning how to see. She took a deep breath and stepped forward. Her parents were already at work, repairing what they could, replanting what had been lost. She knelt beside them, her fingers brushing through the soft, wet soil. The pieces of her herbs were gone, but the space they had occupied wasn't. There was room for something new, room for hope. She set to work, hands steady and purposeful, pushing aside the debris to uncover what was still there, what could still be salvaged. She wouldn't give up. Not now, not when there was still something worth fighting for. As the hours passed, the garden slowly began showing signs of life again. The skirt, though battered, had some roots left. The salsify, though damaged, still held some potential. Elswith and Osrich worked side by side, the rhythm of their movements steady, unbroken by the storm's fury. They had done this many times before and knew that the garden wasn't just about the crops. It was about the process, the work, starting over. By midday, the three had worked through much of the wreckage. They had salvaged what they could, replanted what remained, and set new roots in the empty spaces by the storm's wrath. The air still smelled faintly of rain, and the sky was beginning to clear, but there was a quiet understanding between them that the worst might still be ahead. The storm was over, but the real challenge was beginning. Hiloa stepped back for a moment, looking at the garden. It wasn't perfect. It would never be ideal, but that was the beauty of it. Nothing in life was perfect. The garden reflected that, of struggle, survival, pushing through the most challenging moments to create something that could sustain you. It wasn't the beauty of the plants that mattered, it was their resilience, the way they always seemed to find their way back, no matter how hard the world tried to tear them down. "We'll rebuild," she said softly, more to herself than anyone else. "We'll make it work." Elswith and Osrich paused momentarily, exchanging a quiet look, the unspoken words passing between them. There was no doubt in their minds that they would rebuild and make it work. They had no choice. Together, they had survived worse. Together, they would face whatever came next. As the day began to settle into a quiet, reflective stillness, Hiloa couldn't help but feel a sense of peace wash over her. The storm had taken its toll, but the family had endured. The garden had endured. The cycle of life, death, and rebirth would continue as it always had. And amid that cycle, they would always find a way to move forward. Osrich stood at the edge of the garden, looking out over the work they had done. He was tired, his muscles aching from the physical strain of the day, but there was something in the air, something that told him that no matter what, they would make it. The storm might have left its scars, but they had left their mark on the land too. And that was something no storm could take away. "We've made it through another one," he said, his voice thick with pride. "Together." Elswith nodded, her hand resting on his shoulder. "We always do." And as they stood there, looking out over the land they had fought so hard to protect, the sun finally broke through the clouds, casting a golden glow over the garden. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. And that was enough. For now, it was enough. The morning after the storm passed, I felt eerily calm, as if the world was taking a deep breath before deciding what came next. The sun peeked through the clouds, casting a gentle light over the garden that had been battered and torn the night before. Osrich stood in the middle of the field, his hands on his hips, looking at the aftermath. The work was far from over, but there was a certain weight in the air, a quiet resolve that things would be okay. Elswith was beside him, her gaze scanning the garden with a practiced eye. Her movements were precise, her hands gently brushing over the surviving plants, her touch calming. "The leeks are still standing," she said, her voice steady but holding a trace of cautious optimism. The tall green stalks were bent but not broken. They had weathered the storm, just as they always did. Osrich nodded, but his mind was still working, still calculating the repairs that had to be made, the plants that might be lost, the ones that could still be saved. There was no time to waste. He knew that. The season was already short, and the storm had shortened it, but there was a flicker of something else, too. A quiet pride in how they had handled the storm and immediately started to rebuild, even as the storm was still fresh in their minds. His eyes drifted to Hiloa, crouched beside her small herb patch. She had worked tirelessly since the storm had passed, her fingers deftly working through the soil, trying to salvage what was left of her rocket, lovage, and wormwood. Her face was set with the same quiet determination that Osric had come to expect from her, but there was a deeper, more personal stake in this for Hiloa. These weren't just any plants. These were hers. They were her contribution to the garden and the family's survival. And the storm had torn through them, leaving only scraps. But Hiloa was undeterred. As Osric watched her, he felt a swell of pride. She had learned quickly and absorbed lessons that took him years to grasp. And now, even in the face of what could be seen as a total loss, she wasn't turning away. She wasn't defeated. She was working to salvage what she could, working to make something out of the mess left behind. "What do you think, Hiloa?" Osric called out to her, his voice carrying across the garden. She looked up, her eyes flicking between the shattered remains of her herbs and the plants that had survived. She paused momentarily, then stood up, brushing the dirt from her knees. "I think we need to replant," she said simply. "The ones that survived, the rocket and lovage, they're not done. They're waiting." Elswith smiled softly. "That's the spirit," she said. "Sometimes the plants just need a little time, a little care, and we've got plenty of both." Osric watched Hiloa for a moment longer, taking in her determination. "You've got a good head on your shoulders," he said, approvingly nodding. "We'll get them through. We'll get it all through. It's what we do." There was a moment of silence as the three of them stood there in the garden, the weight of the storm still heavy in the air, but the strength of their resolve slowly grew stronger with each passing minute. They had survived worse before, and if the storm was a test, then they had passed it. Now they had to rebuild. The ground had been broken, the plants had been torn, but they were still standing, and as long as they were standing, they had a chance. Later that afternoon, they had made significant progress as the sun began to dip low in the sky. Hiloa's herbs had been replanted, the surviving ones carefully spaced out in the soil. The salsify, though damaged, had roots that still held promise. It wasn't a perfect recovery, but it was progress, and that was enough for now. The skirret had been reburied in a new patch where the wind wouldn't be so harsh, and the sturdy and defiant leeks stood tall in their spot, waiting for the coming days. Elswith wiped the sweat from her brow, standing back to survey their work. Though not what it had been before the storm, the garden was starting to look like something they could work with again. It wasn't the lush paradise they had hoped for, but a garden nonetheless, and that was what mattered. They had weathered the storm and come out of it stronger. But as the day wore on, a nagging thought kept creeping into the back of Osric's mind. The storm had left its mark, but so had the passage of time. The weather wasn't what it used to be, and the land seemed to change, becoming less predictable and less forgiving. Was this just another freak storm, or was something deeper at play? Was the world they had known for so long starting to shift beneath their feet? He couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing, that the world they had built and the land they had relied on might not always be there in the way they had expected. The storms were getting stronger. The seasons were growing harsher. It wasn't just the crops that were at risk. It was everything. Their way of life. Their future. Elswith, noticing his distant look, walked over to him, her expression soft. She could see the worry etched on his face. She had seen it before. When the rains didn't come, the crops failed, and the winds howled too fiercely. It was the worry of a man who had seen too many seasons pass, too many storms tear through his life, and who knew that nothing was ever as specific as it seemed. "What's on your mind?" she asked gently, touching his shoulder. Osric hesitated, glancing out over the garden. The patch of soil where the skirret had been, now replanted, stood out to him, a symbol of everything they had fought for, but it also reminded him of what they could lose. "I don't know," he said finally. "I just keep thinking, what if it's not enough? What if we can't keep up with the storms? The weather's been different lately. We've been lucky, but luck can only carry you so far." Elswith's gaze softened as she looked at him. She knew his fears, but she also knew him too well to let him give in to them. "We've made it this far, Osrich," she said, "and as long as we're still standing, we'll keep fighting. We always have." He nodded, his gaze shifting to Hiloa, still working, her hands moving carefully through the soil. "I know," he said quietly. "I know." The day faded into night, and with it, the storm's aftermath began to feel less like a threat and more like a challenge. Osrich and Elswith stood side by side as they watched the stars start to appear overhead. There was no grand sense of victory, no sudden realization that everything would be fine. But there was something else, something more profound. They had survived another storm. They had weathered the worst of it. And that, for now, was enough. In the garden, new life was already taking hold amidst the torn leaves and roots. And as long as they had that and the strength to keep going, they would always find a way to move forward, together. The days following the storm had blurred together as the family continued their work on the garden. The sun had returned, its rays warming the earth, but the wind still whispered through the trees, a constant reminder of the night's fury. Osrich found himself waking earlier each morning, his mind already filled with the day's tasks. He couldn't afford to let the storm break him. The land wouldn't wait for his doubts. Yet in the back of his mind, the nagging feeling lingered. What if the storms were becoming worse? What if this time they hadn't been lucky enough to make it through unscathed? Elswith was the first to sense his unease. She'd always had a sharp intuition when it came to Osrich's moods. He was a man of few words, but she knew the weight of his silences. As they worked together in the garden one afternoon, she noticed him glancing at the sky more often than usual, his brow furrowed as he wiped his hands on his worn trousers. "Something's bothering you," Elswith said, her voice gentle but knowing. Osrich didn't immediately answer. He took a deep breath, looking out over the garden they had salvaged. The plants were coming back, slowly, surely, but something about the sight didn't sit right with him. He had spent years working the land, but never had it felt so uncertain. "It's the storms," he said finally, his voice low. "They're getting stronger, I can feel it. Last year was bad, but this feels different." Elswith followed his gaze, her eyes sweeping across the garden where the skirret, leeks, and salsify had begun to grow back. The earth was healing, but there was an uneasiness in the air that she couldn't shake either. The winds had been stronger, the rain heavier, and the crops that had once been reliable weren't as certain anymore. "We've made it through before," she said, her voice steady, trying to ground him, "and we'll make it through again. We always do." Osrich met her gaze, his eyes filled with the weight of his thoughts. "But for how long, Elswith? For how long will we keep making it through?" Elswith didn't have an answer. The truth was, she was just as uncertain as he was. They had lived through countless seasons, weathered storms, both literal and metaphorical, but this felt different. It wasn't just the weather, it was the land itself. The seasons were changing, the rhythms of life shifting in ways they hadn't anticipated. In the distance, Hiloa was working, her hands buried in the soil of her little herb patch. She had already replanted her rocket, lovage, and wormwood, determined to bring them back to life despite the damage the storm had done. Hiloa had always been a quiet child, but her resilience had grown over the years, a reflection of the world around her. If the garden could survive, so could she. Osrich watched her for a moment, then turned back to Elswith. "Hiloa's growing up too fast," he said, a hint of something in his voice that she couldn't quite place. "She's more like us than I thought." Elswith smiled softly, though the smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "She's got your strength," she said. "She'll make it." "I hope so," Osrich replied, "but I can't help but wonder if we've given her a world she won't be able to keep up with." Elswith didn't respond at first. She didn't have the answer to that question either. The world was changing, faster than they could keep up. But one thing she knew for sure, Hiloa would have a chance. She would have the chance to rebuild, just like they always had. As they continued their work, the day wore on and the sky began to darken. The storm had passed, but a new sense of urgency settled in the air. The winds, though lighter now, still held a bite to them. It wasn't just the weather that had changed, it was everything. The land was harder now, the soil more unforgiving. They had to be smarter, faster. and they had to prepare for what came next, whatever that might be. That evening, after a quiet meal of simple soup made from the surviving vegetables, the family gathered together in the small cottage. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the room. They had done everything they could for the day. But despite the warmth of the fire and the comfort of each other's presence, a quiet tension lingered in the room. Hiloa sat across from her parents, her brow furrowed in thought. She was quiet, always had been, but tonight there was something different about the way she held herself. She was growing, no doubt about it, but the world outside was growing harsher too. The garden, though it had survived the storm, seemed like a fragile thing now, and Hiloa, for the first time, wondered if her small patch of herbs would be enough. She wasn't sure anymore. Elswith noticed the way Hiloa was staring at her hands, the way she wasn't joining in the conversation. She knew the storm had shaken Hiloa as much as it had shaken the land itself. "Is everything all right?" Elswith asked gently, her voice soft but carrying the weight of a mother's concern. Hiloa looked up, meeting her mother's gaze. For a moment she didn't speak. She just stared at her, as if unsure of how to express what she was feeling. Finally, she broke the silence. "I don't know if we can keep doing this," Hiloa said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if the garden will be enough anymore. What if the storms keep getting worse? What if we can't grow what we need? What if—" "Stop," Elswith interrupted softly, her voice filled with quiet strength. "We'll always find a way. We always do. That's what we do here. We find a way." Osric nodded, his eyes softening as he looked at his daughter. "She's right," he said, his voice low. "It's not about the storms. It's about what we do after, how we rebuild, how we keep going. You don't need to have all the answers, Hiloa. Not yet." Hiloa looked at them, the weight of their words settling in her chest. She wasn't sure what the future held, but in that moment she understood something important. It wasn't the storms that defined them. It wasn't the winds or the rain. It was what they did afterward. It was how they got back up. As the night stretched on, the storm outside now a distant memory, Hiloa finally felt the last of her doubt slip away. The world might be changing, the storms might be fiercer, but they would keep going. They would rebuild. They had to. And when the morning came again, the family would rise with it, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The world outside might be unpredictable, but their strength wasn't. Together, they would always find a way. And that was enough. As Osrich and Elswith exchanged a quiet glance, they both knew the truth of it. There would always be storms. But as long as they had each other, they would survive them. Together, they would always rebuild. The days after the storm had passed were filled with a quiet tension. The garden was recovering slowly, but the weight of the damage hung heavy over the family. Osrich, ever the practical one, had thrown himself into the work with a determination that bordered on obsession. Each morning, before the sun had fully risen, he was already out in the garden, checking the plants, inspecting the soil, and digging up what remained of the crops that had been torn by the winds. His hands were raw, his back sore, but there was a fire in his chest that wouldn't let him stop. Elswith worked alongside him, her movements graceful despite the exhaustion. She wasn't as physically strong as Osrich, but her hands knew the land as well as anyone's. Together they repaired what they could, replanting the leeks, the skirret, and the salsify. Their small efforts felt insignificant in the face of the vast damage, but they did it anyway. The garden wasn't just a source of food, it was a symbol of survival, of resilience. It was something they had nurtured together for years, and they weren't about to give up on it now. Hiloa, too, had found herself working harder than ever. Her patch of herbs, the rocket, the lovage, and the wormwood, had been almost completely destroyed by the storm. But, like her parents, she refused to let it defeat her. The storm had taken away what she had so carefully nurtured, but that didn't mean she couldn't try again. So she replanted, doing her best to save what she could, her small hands digging deep into the earth, her mind focused on the task. It wasn't just about the herbs, it was about proving to herself that she could rebuild, that the world hadn't beaten her down yet. It was during one of these long days in the garden that Osrich, for the first time in weeks, took a break. He sat down on the ground, his back against the half-constructed stone wall that surrounded their plot. The garden was quiet for a moment, the only sound being the distant hum of the wind as it passed through the trees. Elswith sat beside him, wiping the sweat from her forehead as she surveyed the work they had done. "You're pushing yourself too hard," Elswith said, her voice gentle but firm. She knew him too well. He had been working non-stop, barely resting, and she could see the toll it was taking on him. "You need to take a break." Osrich sighed, wiping his hands on his pants. "I can't. We have to fix this. The crops, the garden, everything. We don't have time to waste." "I know," Elswith replied softly, "but you can't keep going like this. You're wearing yourself thin." Osrich didn't answer right away. His mind was too focused on the work ahead. There was always something to do, something that needed fixing. But Elswith was right. The storm had taken a lot from them, but it wasn't just the land that was damaged. It was their spirits, too. And if they weren't careful, that could be the thing that broke them. Hiloa walked over to them, her face streaked with dirt, but her eyes filled with determination. She stood there for a moment, glancing at the work they had done, then at her father. She could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the way he was pushing himself, and for the first time, she felt the weight of it too. They had all been working so hard, but for what? The storm had shown them just how fragile everything was. The garden, the crops, their future. All of it was uncertain. And no matter how much they worked, there was no guarantee it would be enough. "We'll get through this," Hiloa said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of her own thoughts. She wasn't sure if she was saying it for herself or for them, but she meant it. "We've faced worse. We always find a way." Osrich looked at her, the lines of worry on his face softening just a bit. His daughter had always been strong, but in that moment he saw something else in her, something that reminded him of himself when he was younger. The resilience, the determination. It was the same fire that had driven him to work the land, to fight through the storms and the hardships. And in that fire he found a glimmer of hope. "You're right," he said, his voice quieter now. "We've been through worse. But I'm not sure we can keep doing it like this. The storms, they're different now." Elswith nodded, understanding what he was saying. The world was changing, faster than they could keep up with. The seasons were unpredictable, the storms fiercer. They had always relied on the rhythm of the earth, the growing seasons, the harvests, the cycles that had been in place for generations. But now, those rhythms were shifting, and for the first time, they weren't sure how to keep up. The silence hung in the air for a moment, thick and heavy. The garden stretched out before them, a patchwork of old and new, of survival and struggle. The work wasn't finished, not by a long shot, but for the first time in a long while, Osrich allowed himself to take a step back, to really look at what they had done. Despite the storm's fury, despite the uncertainty, they had rebuilt, together. And that was something, wasn't it? "We'll figure it out," Osrich said, his voice steady now. "We always do." Elswith smiled softly, though her eyes were filled with the same quiet worry. "We've survived storms before, and we'll survive this one." And so they carried on, each of them in their own way. Osrich worked on repairing the remaining parts of the garden, making sure the soil was right, that the plants had what they needed to grow back strong. Elswith continued to tend to the surviving crops, making sure nothing went to waste. And Hiloa, despite the damage to her herb patch, continued to plant, continued to hope. As the days stretched on, the garden began to show signs of life once again. The skirret sprouted, though it was smaller than before. The leeks stood taller, their green stalks reaching for the sun, and the salsify, though scarred from the storm, began to recover, its roots slowly taking hold in the earth once more. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't the way it used to be, but it was enough, and for now, that was all they needed. The garden wasn't just a source of food. It was a reminder that no matter how many storms came their way, they could rebuild, together. As the family sat down for another simple meal, the sun setting behind the hills, Osrich looked around at them. Elswith, Hiloa, the garden they had worked so hard to rebuild. The storm had been fierce, yes, but so had they. They had weathered it, and they would continue to weather whatever came next. Together, always. "We'll make it through," Osrich said softly as he looked at his family. "We always do." And for the first time in days, he believed it. The days began to grow longer, the seasons slowly turning toward the promise of summer. The storm that had once felt like an insurmountable force now seemed like a distant memory, the echoes of its fury fading into the past. But for Osrich, Elswith, and Hiloa, the reality was far from over. The garden had started to recover, but the work was far from finished. The ground, though once scarred and broken, was beginning to show signs of life. The plants were growing slowly, cautiously, almost as if they too were waiting for the next test. And the family, like the garden, was slowly finding its way back, piece by piece, root by root. Every day was a battle, but it wasn't the kind of battle that came with swords or shields. It was the quiet, relentless fight of survival. Osrich woke each morning with the rising sun, his mind already focused on the tasks ahead. The soil needed tending. The crops needed attention. He had learned long ago that the earth didn't care about your plans. It didn't care about your hopes or dreams. The land only responded to hard work, to sweat, to patience. And so each day, Osric worked as though his life depended on it, because in many ways, it did. Elswith, as always, was by his side. Her hands moved with a fluidity that came from years of practice. The small, steady movements of someone who had learned the rhythms of the land as if it were her second skin. She worked the garden with the same quiet grace that she had always carried through life. But even she could feel the strain of it all. The storm had torn something inside them all, something deep, and no matter how much they worked, no matter how much they rebuilt, it felt like a part of them had been lost. The garden wasn't just a piece of land, it was their lifeline. It was a part of them. And when it was broken, so were they. But as the days wore on, there was a quiet realization that despite the damage, despite the loss, they still had it. They still had each other. Hiloa too had found her place in the rebuilding process. Her herb garden, once so carefully tended, had been reduced to nothing more than a scattering of broken leaves and uprooted roots. But like her parents, she wasn't willing to give up. She dug into the soil, her fingers moving through the earth with a desperation she hadn't known she had. She planted new herbs, new seeds, hoping for something to grow, hoping for the land to forgive her for the loss she felt. And though the work was exhausting, though the garden was far from what it had once been, there was something comforting in the process. She could still make it grow. She could still nurture life, no matter how small or fragile it seemed. Days passed and the landscape slowly transformed. Where there had once been chaos, now there was a tentative order. The skirt, which had once been torn apart by the storm's violence, had begun to show signs of regrowth. The roots, though scarred, were starting to send out shoots. The leeks, though bent from the wind, stood tall and proud, their green stalks reaching toward the sky. And the salsify, though battered, had begun to show small signs of new growth, as though daring the family to believe in it again. The garden was coming back, slowly, surely. But even as they worked, even as they labored in the soil, there was a growing sense of unease. The storm had been a warning, and Osrich couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't the last. The seasons were changing faster than they could keep up with, and the earth was becoming less predictable. The plants that had once thrived here were beginning to struggle. The soil, once rich and full of promise, seemed tired, and Osrich feared that no matter how hard they worked, no matter how much they planted, the land wouldn't always be enough. One evening, as the family sat down to another quiet meal, the weight of the day's work still heavy in the air, Osrich looked at Elswith and Hiloa, both of whom were tired, their eyes filled with a quiet determination. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room, but the warmth of the fire couldn't fully chase away the chill in Osrich's chest. He didn't know what was coming next, but he felt the ground shifting beneath him. He could sense it, the change in the seasons, the change in the world around them. The storm had been a harbinger, and the garden, despite its recovery, couldn't shield them from what was to come. "I keep thinking about the storm," Osrich said quietly, his voice rough from exhaustion, "about how it was so much worse than we expected." Elswith looked at him, her eyes soft, but filled with the same concern that had been growing in her heart since the storm had passed. "We've made it through worse, Osrich," she said gently, "and we'll make it through this too." Osrich didn't respond immediately. He knew his wife was right. He knew she always was, but the uncertainty still gnawed at him. The weather had been erratic, unpredictable, and he couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the edge of something bigger, something more. Hiloa, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. "We can handle it," she said, her voice filled with a quiet confidence that surprised even her parents. "The garden might be different, but we can still make it grow. We just have to keep trying, keep working." Osrich and Elswith exchanged a long glance, both of them seeing something in their daughter's eyes that they hadn't expected. She was right, of course. The garden had changed. The world had changed. But that didn't mean they couldn't adapt. That didn't mean they couldn't keep going. It was hard, it was uncertain, and sometimes it felt like the ground was slipping away from them, but they had each other. And that, they knew, was enough to get them through. "We'll keep working," Osrich said, finally breaking the silence. "We'll rebuild, we'll adapt, that's what we do." Elswith nodded, her hand reaching out to take his. "We always do." And for the first time in days, the weight on Osrich's chest felt a little lighter. The world was changing, the storms were coming, but they were still here. And as long as they had each other, they would find a way to make it through. They always did. The next morning, they woke early, the sun barely peeking over the horizon. They stood together in the garden, looking at the crops they had worked so hard to rebuild. The skirret, the leeks, the salsify, each plant had a new life, a new chance. The storm might have torn them down, but they were still here. And as long as the family was still here, there was always hope. The road ahead would be long, and the challenges would be many. But in that moment, standing together in the garden, Osrich, Elswith, and Hiloa knew one thing for sure. They would face whatever came next together. They always had. And they always would, no matter what the world threw at them. The storm had passed, but its aftermath lingered in the air like an uninvited guest that overstayed its welcome. Osrich stood in the middle of the garden, his boots sinking slightly into the wet soil, staring at the damage left behind. The wind had torn through the crops, leaving a trail of destruction. The sky above, once dark with the storm's fury, had now cleared, but the earth seemed to carry the weight of the storm's wrath. There was a certain stillness now, almost as if the world was holding its breath, uncertain of what would come next. It wasn't just the garden that had been affected, it was everything. The soil, once rich and full of promise, seemed to have turned colder, less forgiving. The plants that had been thriving now lay broken or bent, their roots struggling to find the stability they had once enjoyed. But Osrich knew that the land would heal. It always did. The earth had a way of bouncing back, of finding its way through the hardest seasons. He'd seen it happen before, but something about this storm felt different, as if the world itself was changing, pushing them to adapt in ways they hadn't prepared for. Elswith walked up beside him, her face drawn with exhaustion but still holding a quiet strength. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she surveyed the damage with the same practiced eye that had seen many seasons come and go. She could feel it too, that underlying tension. The storm hadn't just tested their crops, it had tested them. They had weathered hardships before, but this was different. This was a challenge that went beyond the land. It was a challenge of survival itself. "What do you think?" Osrich asked, his voice quiet, almost reluctant to break the silence that had settled over them. Elswith sighed, her hands resting on her hips. "I think it's going to take time," she said, her voice steady but tinged with concern. "The land's tired, Osrich. It's been through a lot." He nodded slowly, his eyes tracing the rows of broken plants. The leeks had survived, but they were bent and battered. The skirret was barely recognizable, its roots exposed to the air. The salsify, once so proud, was now tangled and twisted in the soil. But despite the damage, life still clung to the land. There were small green shoots poking through the earth, fragile but determined. The storm hadn't taken everything. It never did. But what came next? What would they do to ensure that the next season didn't bring the same devastation? "Do you think we'll make it?" Osrich asked, his words heavy with the weight of his uncertainty. Elswith met his gaze, her eyes filled with a quiet resolve. "We've always made it," she said. "We've made it through storms before, and we'll make it through this one." But even as she said the words, she knew there was more to it than that. The world was changing. The storms were growing more frequent, more violent. The land wasn't as forgiving as it once was. She had seen it in the way the soil responded to their efforts, in the way the plants struggled to grow. There was no guarantee anymore, no certainty that their hard work would be enough. The seasons were shifting, and they would have to shift with them. As they continued to work, repairing what they could, replanting what was salvageable, the weight of the future pressed down on them both. Haloa, their daughter, had been working alongside them, her small hands moving with a steady determination. Her herb patch had been destroyed by the storm, but she hadn't given up. She dug into the soil, planting new seeds, her brow furrowed in concentration. The loss of her herbs had stung, but Haloa was learning the lesson of resilience. The garden, like life, wasn't always about perfection. It was about persistence. It was about finding a way to keep going, no matter how many times the world knocked you down. As the days passed, the family worked tirelessly, rebuilding the garden bit by bit, but there was something different in the air now. The urgency that had fueled their efforts after the storm began to fade into something else, something quieter but no less intense. The garden was coming back, yes, but the future felt uncertain. The storm had been a wake-up call. It had shown them that the world was no longer as predictable as it once had been. The seasons, the weather, the land, it was all shifting, and they would have to adapt if they wanted to survive. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a soft golden glow over the garden, Osric sat down on a weathered log. He wiped his brow, his muscles sore from the day's work. Elswith joined him, sitting beside him in silence for a few moments. The garden, now with new growth starting to push through the soil, looked like a patchwork of recovery. The damage was still evident, but it was no longer as overwhelming. They had done what they could. The plants were showing signs of life. And yet, there was something about this recovery that felt different. Fragile, perhaps. Not as solid as it had been in years past. Hiloa's right, Osric said quietly, his voice soft against the evening air. We'll make it through. We always do. Elswith didn't respond right away. Instead, she looked out over the garden, her thoughts lost in the waves of the past and future. She had seen so many seasons come and go, each one with its own set of challenges. But this time it felt like something had shifted, something fundamental that they couldn't ignore. The land, the storms, the cycles, they were all changing. And that change was coming faster than they were prepared for. We will, she finally said, her voice steady. But it's going to be different. This storm, it's a sign, a reminder that we need to be ready for whatever comes next. Osric nodded, his gaze drifting to the horizon where the last light of day was fading. The world was vast, unpredictable, and there was so much they couldn't control. But the one thing they could control was how they responded to it. They could choose to give up, to let the uncertainty break them, or they could choose to keep going, to keep fighting, to keep planting, to keep working. We'll keep working, Osric said, his voice firm now, filled with that same quiet resolve. Whatever comes next, we'll face it, together. Elswith smiled, her hand reaching out to rest on his. Together, she agreed. As the evening deepened and the first stars began to appear in the sky, the family sat in silence, their hearts filled with a quiet, unspoken understanding. The future was uncertain, yes. The storms would come again, perhaps stronger than before, but they had each other. And as long as they had that, there was no storm they couldn't face. In the garden, the first signs of new life began to push through the soil, fragile but determined. The land, like the family, was healing, slowly but surely. The storms had left their mark, but they hadn't broken them. And as the stars twinkled above, the promise of another season, another chance, filled the air. They had made it through this storm, and they would make it through whatever came next. Together, always. The seasons had shifted once again, and though the storms seemed to have calmed, the weight of the aftermath still lingered. It had been a few weeks since the storm that had tested their resilience, but the memories of those dark days still hung like a cloud over the family. Osric, Elswith, and Haloa had poured everything they had into the garden, working day after day to repair the damage. The earth had slowly begun to heal, but so had they. There was a quiet sense of unity in their efforts, a realization that they were stronger together than they ever realized. Yet, even as the garden showed signs of recovery, Osrich couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing at the edge of something uncertain. The days were longer now, and the crops were beginning to grow back, slowly but surely. But Osrich's mind never seemed to stop working. He found himself constantly scanning the skies, watching the clouds roll in, feeling the breeze shift in ways that made him uneasy. The weather had changed, and it wasn't just the storms. There was something about the land itself, something subtle but undeniable, that made him feel as if the world was inching towards something bigger. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but the way the crops grew, how the leeks stood taller than usual, the skirret and salsify pushing through the soil with more vigor, didn't feel like the rhythms of the past. He had seen storms before, had lived through the hardest winters, but the unpredictability of this new world felt like a different kind of battle. The plants were resilient, but they were also vulnerable. So was he. So was his family. He didn't want to voice it, but he couldn't escape the fear that the land they had always relied on might one day betray them. Elswith, ever attuned to his moods, noticed the change in his demeanor. There was something more restless in the way he moved now. The long days of work, of rebuilding what had been broken, had only deepened the line of worry on his face. "You're thinking too much," Elswith said one evening as they stood in the garden, the sun dipping low and casting long shadows over the rows of growing plants. She had been watching him, noticing how his hands were clenched tighter around the trowel, how his gaze kept drifting toward the horizon. "You've been quiet these last few days. What's on your mind?" Osrich hesitated before he answered, his voice quiet, almost as if he was weighing his words. "I'm not sure we're doing enough," he finally admitted. "The storms, the changing seasons, it feels like we're fighting something bigger than us. I can feel it, Elswith. The land isn't the same. We might not be able to keep up with it." Elswith looked at him, her gaze soft but knowing. "We've always found a way, haven't we?" She replied, her voice steady. "We rebuild when things fall apart. We adapt when the world changes. It's what we've always done. The land may be shifting, but we're not done yet. Not by a long shot." He nodded, but the doubt lingered in his chest, heavy and unshakable. Hiloa, hearing the conversation from the side of the garden where she had been tending to her herbs, walked over. The storm had tested her too, stripping away the small corner of the garden she had built for herself, but she had rebuilt it, just like her parents. Her small hands dug into the earth as if they could press the soil back into place, back to its old rhythms. "Do you think the garden will be enough?" she asked, her voice unexpectedly serious for her age. "What if it's not? What if the storms keep coming and the crops don't grow the way they used to?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, but it mirrored the fear that had been growing in all of them. What if they couldn't make it through the next storm? What if they didn't have the strength to rebuild again? What if the earth that had always fed them, that had always provided, started to give out? Osric looked at his daughter, his heart tightening. "I don't know, Hiloa," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "But we'll do what we always do. We'll work harder. We'll fight for it." Hiloa's eyes held his for a moment before she nodded, as if trying to take in the weight of her father's words. She was strong, perhaps stronger than he had given her credit for, but there was still a part of her that didn't fully understand the gravity of the struggle they faced. Yet in that moment, he could see a spark in her, something that reflected both her parents' strength and resilience. She didn't ask for more reassurance. Instead, she simply returned to her work, her hands steady as she continued planting, her mind clearly focused on the task at hand. Elswith placed a gentle hand on Osrich's arm, bringing his attention back to the garden in front of them. "We've weathered storms before, Osrich," she said, her voice firm. "This is no different. We've always rebuilt. Our home, our lives. Together, we can handle whatever comes next." Her words rang true, but Osrich couldn't help but feel that the world was growing less predictable. There was something in the air, in the way the plants grew and the seasons turned, that made him feel as though they were racing against time. How much longer could they keep going like this? How much longer could they rely on a world that was becoming more hostile, more uncertain by the day? As the days stretched on, the family continued to work, finding solace in the act of rebuilding. The garden showed new signs of life, though it would take time for it to return to what it had once been. Each plant, each crop was a small victory, a reminder that no matter how much the world changed, there was always a chance to grow again. But the storms kept coming. They were a constant, looming threat. As the harvest season approached, Osrich couldn't shake the unease that had settled deep in his chest. Despite their hard work, despite their best efforts, the fear that the next storm could undo everything still lingered. One afternoon, as the family gathered in the small house after a long day in the garden, the wind began to pick up again. The sky darkened with heavy clouds, and the temperature dropped suddenly. Elswith and Hiloa both looked at Osrich, sensing the change in the air, the familiar tension that came before a storm. Osrich stood by the window, his eyes narrowing as he watched the clouds gather on the horizon. It was coming again, another storm. "We have to prepare," he said, his voice resolute. "We can't be caught off guard again." The family didn't need to ask what he meant. They had faced storms together before. But this time the urgency was different. This time it wasn't just about surviving the storm, it was about what came after. What would they do if this storm destroyed everything they had worked for? Would they have the strength to rebuild once more? They had no choice but to try. The storm was coming, and they would face it head-on, together. The sky may darken, the winds may howl, but the family knew one thing for certain: they wouldn't let it break them. Not this time. Not ever again. As the storm clouds rolled in, Osrich, Elswith, and Hiloa worked side by side, gathering what they could to protect the garden, reinforcing their home, making sure that no matter what happened, they would be ready. And when the storm hit, they would face it, as they always had, together. The storm came in the dead of night, with a suddenness that left no time to prepare. One moment, the skies were heavy with an eerie calm, and the next, the wind howled like a wild animal, tearing through the trees and rattling the windows. Osrich, Elswith, and Hiloa had just finished securing the house when the first flash of lightning illuminated the dark horizon, followed by a deafening crack of thunder that seemed to shake the very ground beneath them. Osrich stood at the window, staring out into the night, his face pale but resolute. He knew what this storm meant. The winds were stronger than they had ever been, the sky an unforgiving shade of black. The first gust of wind slammed against the house with a force that rattled the walls, followed by the eerie sound of the trees bending and creaking, as if they were groaning under the weight of the storm. Elswith joined him by the window, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, eyes trained on the horizon. She didn't need to speak. The fear was palpable between them, but they both knew there was no use in worrying about the things they couldn't control. What mattered now was how they would weather this. What mattered was that they were still together, still holding on. "Do you think it will be as bad as the last one?" Elswith asked, her voice barely rising above the wind. Osrich didn't answer immediately. His eyes narrowed, studying the trees bending under the pressure of the storm, the flashes of lightning illuminating the night sky. His instincts were telling him this wasn't just another bad storm. No, this one was different. It felt like the world was shifting again, and this time, they might not come out unscathed. "I don't know," he finally said, "but we need to be ready. We have to protect what we can. The garden, the house, everything." Elswith nodded, a sense of urgency in her every movement. She knew, just like he did, that this wasn't just about surviving the storm. This was about survival itself. The garden had been their lifeline, their connection to the earth, and to lose it now, after everything they had worked for, felt almost too much to bear. But they couldn't afford to think that way. There was no room for fear. They had to endure, no matter what. Outside, the storm grew fiercer, the wind tearing through the trees, snapping branches in half and sending leaves swirling into the air. The rain came in sheets, pouring down in torrents that blurred the view beyond the window. The sound was deafening, like the roar of a great wave crashing against the shore. The house groaned and creaked, and for a moment, Osrich wondered if it would hold against the battering force of the storm. Hiloa, who had been huddled by the hearth with a book, now stood by their side. Her face was pale, eyes wide with fear. "Do you think the garden will make it through this?" she asked quietly, her voice barely audible over the wind. Osrich met her gaze, his heart heavy with the same fear. The garden was everything to them. It was their food, their survival, their hope. But if this storm was as bad as it seemed, if the wind tore through the crops like it had in the past, they could lose everything. I don't know, he admitted, but we've got to try. Elswith put a hand on Heloa's shoulder, her touch reassuring despite the chaos around them. Whatever happens, we'll face it together, she said, her voice steady. We always do. They all stood together by the window, watching as the storm raged on. The wind screamed through the trees, sending a chill through the air, even inside the house. The sky flashed with lightning every few seconds, lighting up the darkened landscape. The sound of the storm was deafening, and yet, in the midst of it all, there was something strangely calming about standing there, together, as the world outside seemed to be falling apart. But this storm wasn't just an external force. It was a test of everything they had built, everything they had worked for. The garden had always been their connection to the earth, their way of living off the land, of sustaining themselves. And now, with this storm bearing down on them, they had to trust that the earth would hold its promise, that their hard work, their persistence would see them through. The storm raged on for hours, its fury unrelenting. The house creaked and groaned as the wind battered it, but it held firm. Inside, the family huddled together in the warmth of the hearth, doing their best to block out the world outside. The storm didn't care about their hopes, their dreams, or their hard work. It was just another force of nature that didn't care who it hurt. But in the face of it, they were a family. And that was the one thing the storm could never take away. By the time the storm began to lose its intensity, the sky had shifted from pitch black to a deep purple. The wind slowly died down and the rain began to taper off. Osric stood up from the hearth and moved to the window, looking out at the destruction. The garden had been battered, that much was certain. The crops that had stood proudly the day before now lay flattened in the mud, their once strong stalks bent and broken. The leeks, once so proud, now seemed to bow low to the earth as if defeated. Elswith joined him at the window, her eyes scanning the garden. It's not over yet, she said quietly. There's still hope. Osrich nodded, though his heart was heavy. It wasn't just the garden that had been damaged, it was everything. The land, the seasons, the certainty they had always relied on. The storm was a reminder of how little control they had over the world around them. The earth was shifting, changing, and no matter how hard they worked, no matter how much they fought, there were no guarantees. But as they stood there, watching the rain fade into the horizon, something in Osrich's heart shifted. There was no use in dwelling on the things they couldn't control. What mattered was what they could do, what they could rebuild. The garden would recover, just as they always had. It might not be the same, but it would be enough. We'll rebuild, Osric said softly, his voice filled with quiet determination. We always do. Elswith looked at him, her eyes filled with a quiet strength. Together, she said, her voice steady. The storm had tested them, yes. It had shaken them to their core, reminding them of the fragility of life, of everything they held dear. But it had also shown them something else, their strength, their resilience, and their unbreakable bond. No matter what came next, they would face it together, always. And as the first light of dawn broke through the storm clouds, casting a golden glow over the garden, they knew one thing for sure. They had made it through this storm, and they would make it through whatever came next. Together. The morning after the storm, the world felt heavy. The rain had finally stopped, but its after effects lingered in the air, damp, cool, and filled with a sense of something unsettled. Osrich stood in the doorway of their small house, his hands braced against the frame as he looked out over the garden. The storm had ravaged the land. The once proud rows of leeks were bent low, the fragile shoots of skirret had been uprooted, and the salsify was now a mess of twisted stems and broken roots. The storm had come like a beast, unrelenting, and it had torn through their lives, leaving nothing untouched. But Osric wasn't about to let it break him. He stood there for a moment longer, the wind still carrying the chill of the night before turning back into the house. Elswith was already awake, sitting at the table, a small cup of tea in her hands. Her eyes were tired, the lines on her face deeper than before, but there was something in her gaze, something firm, something unyielding. "It's worse than I thought," Osrich said as he sat down beside her. Elswith nodded, her expression somber. "I know, but we'll fix it. We always do." There was a quiet understanding between them. They had been through so much together, faced down countless storms, both literal and figurative. This one was just another test. They would rebuild, like they always did. But there was something about this storm that felt different. The wind had felt fiercer, the rains heavier, and the damage, though they could still salvage some of the garden, had left a scar deeper than anything they had faced before. Hiloa came into the room then, her face pale, her eyes wide with the exhaustion of a sleepless night. She had been helping in the garden during the worst of the storm, but now she seemed unsure, as if she couldn't quite process what had happened. She had watched as the wind howled through the garden, had seen the trees bend under the force of nature. She had watched the plants, the very things they relied on for survival, crumple, their fragile stems snapping like brittle twigs. And now, as the day began, the reality of what they had lost settled in her chest, heavy and unrelenting. "I tried to save the rocket and lavage, but..." Her voice trailed off, too choked with emotion to continue. Elswith stood up and crossed the room, placing a hand on Hiloa's shoulder. "I know. It wasn't just you. We all did everything we could." Her voice was soft but firm. "The garden, the land, it will heal. We'll heal." Osrich glanced at his daughter, his heart heavy with a mixture of pride and concern. He saw the strength in her, the same quiet determination that had kept them going through every season, every hardship. But even the strongest of them all had their breaking points. And this storm had shaken something deep inside Hiloa. Osrich had seen it in the way she worked, the way she had thrown herself into the task of replanting and salvaging, even when there seemed to be no hope left. But now, the full weight of what they had lost pressed down on her, and it was clear that she didn't know how to move forward from here. Osrich pushed back from the table, standing up and walking toward the door. He knew they couldn't stand around and dwell on the loss forever. The storm was over, but the work wasn't done. If anything, it had just begun. "We'll fix what's broken," he said, his voice low but resolute. "We'll replant, we'll rebuild. It's what we do." Hiloa wiped her eyes, taking in a shaky breath before following him outside. Elswith was right behind her, offering her silent support. The family walked into the garden together, taking stock of the damage as they went. It was worse than they had feared. The garden that had once been a symbol of their hard work, their connection to the land, now looked like a battlefield. The plants they had nurtured for months were now scattered, bent, or crushed. There was no easy way to look at it. The storm had taken so much, but there was something else, too. Something more important than the loss of the crops. It was the reminder that nothing in life was permanent. Not the garden, not the seasons, and certainly not the storms. They stood together for a moment, just looking out over the garden, the wind gently blowing through the broken plants, the rainwater pooling in small puddles on the soil. Hiloa's gaze moved over the remnants of her herb garden. The rocket and lovage she had planted with such care were now barely recognizable, their delicate stems snapped in half. She could feel her heart ache at the sight of it, the loss too much to fully process. But then something shifted. The land, as broken as it seemed, was not entirely lost. Osrich had always taught her that the earth had a way of bouncing back, of healing itself if given the chance. The garden had survived storms before. It had survived worse, and so she would do what her parents had taught her. She would keep going. "Let's start over," Hiloa said quietly, her voice full of quiet resolve. She didn't need to say much more than that. The message was clear. She was ready to move forward, ready to rebuild, just like they always did. Elswith nodded, a small but proud smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. She had always known her daughter had the strength to carry on. "We'll replant, and we'll keep fighting," she said softly, "one plant at a time." Osrich stood tall, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "We'll make it through this, together." And so, together, they began the long, hard work of rebuilding. The storm had done its damage, but it hadn't taken everything. There was still hope, still strength in the family, still a garden to save. They moved with purpose, tending to the broken plants, replanting what they could, and filling the gaps with new seeds. There was no guarantee that the new crops would grow as strongly as the ones before. There was no guarantee that the storm wouldn't return and take more. But there was something powerful in the act of planting, of giving the earth a second chance. As the day wore on, the family worked side by side, their hands in the soil, their hearts full of quiet determination. And when the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the garden, they paused for a moment, looking at the progress they had made. It wasn't much, not yet, but it was enough. They had taken the first step toward healing. They had taken the first step toward rebuilding, and in that moment they realized something important. No storm, no matter how fierce, could take away their strength. Together they could rebuild. Together they could face whatever came next. The garden, like them, would heal, and it would grow stronger than before. The storm had come and gone, but it had not broken them. And as the stars began to twinkle in the sky above, Osric, Elswith, and Hiloa knew one thing for sure: they would always find a way. They had always made it through, and they always would, together. The days after the storm felt like a blur, a slow recovery that moved in fits and starts. Osric, Elswith, and Hiloa threw themselves into the work with a singular purpose: to rebuild, to restore, to find hope in the broken soil beneath their feet. It had been a rough start to the season, and the garden that had once been their lifeline now seemed fragile, a patchwork of survival. The crops that had survived the storm were weak, their growth stunted by the ferocity of the wind and rain. The leeks, though still standing, were bent at awkward angles. The salsify, the skirret, so much of it had been lost, washed away by the flood of rainwater that had swept through the land. But despite the damage, despite the loss, there was still something to work with. They weren't starting from nothing. They were starting from a place of resilience, from a family who knew how to fight, to adapt, to survive. Osrich stood in the garden early one morning, staring out over the land, his hands on his hips. The sun had barely risen, casting long shadows across the muddy earth. The damage was still obvious: broken plants, flattened crops, the earth scarred from the storm's rage. Yet, in the midst of all the destruction, there were signs of life. The leeks, though bent, had stubbornly pushed their way up through the soil, reaching for the sun. The skirret, though damaged, had started to show tiny shoots of new growth. It wasn't much, but it was something, and for Osric, that was enough. Elswith joined him at the edge of the garden, her hands calloused from days of digging, planting, and fixing. She looked out over the land with a quiet understanding in her eyes. She had seen many storms, many seasons, but this one had been different. The land had been tested in ways it hadn't been before. The storms were stronger, more unpredictable. The world seemed to be shifting in ways they couldn't control. Yet here they were, standing together, rebuilding what had been broken. They had been through the worst, and now they had to fight to make it through the rest. "We'll have to start over with some of the crops," Elswith said, her voice low but steady. "The soil's good, but it's going to take time to recover." Osrich nodded, his eyes scanning the garden. "It always does. It's just, this time, it feels like we're running out of time." Elswith placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch firm but reassuring. "We've made it through worse, Osrich. We always do. The storm was bad, but we've still got each other, and we've got the land. We'll rebuild." He sighed, looking down at the soil beneath his feet. "I know. It's just, everything feels different now. The land, the weather, it's not like it used to be." Elswith didn't argue. She understood the fear that lay beneath his words. The uncertainty that had crept into his heart was the same uncertainty that had been gnawing at her own. The storms were getting worse. The seasons were shifting. It wasn't just the garden that was at risk. It was everything. The earth, the food, the way of life they'd always known. They couldn't control the weather. They couldn't control the changes that were happening around them. But they could control how they responded. And they would respond the only way they knew how: with hard work, with resilience, and with each other. Hiloa stepped into the garden, her hands still dirty from the morning's work. She had been planting new seeds in the spaces where the storm had taken everything. Her face was streaked with dirt, but there was a determination in her eyes that mirrored her parents' own. She hadn't said much since the storm. She hadn't needed to. Her actions spoke louder than words ever could. She had always been quiet, observant, but in this moment, she was resolute. She wasn't just planting seeds, she was planting hope. "We're gonna make it through this, right?" Hiloa asked, her voice soft but filled with a quiet strength. Osrich turned to look at his daughter, his heart swelling with pride. We will. We always do. Elswith smiled, though it was a tired smile, one that carried the weight of too many storms. You've got the strength to make it through, Hiloa. You always have. The three of them stood there for a moment, taking in the state of the garden, the mess of broken plants and scattered crops. But in the midst of all the destruction, there was something else, something that couldn't be destroyed. The land had been battered, but it wasn't dead. The plants had been uprooted, but they were still there, struggling to find their way back. And as long as they had the land, as long as they had each other, there was still hope. Let's get to work, Osrich said, his voice firm. We've got a lot to do. And so they did. They worked together, side by side, planting new seeds in the places where the storm had destroyed the crops. They dug into the soil, turning it, enriching it, giving it the care it needed to heal. There was no magic to it, no shortcuts, just hard work, sweat, and time. As the days passed, the garden slowly began to show signs of life again. The new plants they had seeded began to sprout, fragile little shoots that barely broke through the soil. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep going. The leeks, the skirret, and the salsify, all of them slowly began to recover. The earth was healing, just as they were. It wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be quick. But they could see the progress, the small victories. One evening, as the family sat down to a modest dinner, soup made from what little they had left from the previous season, they shared a quiet meal together, the fire crackling softly in the background. There was a sense of peace in the room, though it was tempered by the knowledge that there was still much to be done. But in that moment, as they passed the bread and ate together, Osrich allowed himself to feel something he hadn't in a long time. Hope. The storms might keep coming. The seasons might keep shifting, but they would face it all together. The land might be uncertain, but the one thing that was never uncertain was their family. And with that strength, they would make it through. They always did. After dinner, as they sat together by the fire, Osrich looked at Elswith and Hiloa, his heart full. We'll get through this, he said, his voice steady. We'll rebuild, and we'll be stronger for it. Elswith nodded, her eyes soft with love and understanding. We always are. And as they sat in the warmth of the firelight with the storm outside beginning to die down, the family knew one thing for sure. Whatever came next, they would face it together, always. The garden, the storm, the changing seasons, they didn't stand a chance against them. The days following the storm felt like a blur, a slow recovery that moved in fits and starts. Osrich, Elswith, and Hiloa threw themselves into the work with a singular purpose: to rebuild, to restore, to find hope in the broken soil beneath their feet. It had been a rough start to the season, and the garden that had once been their lifeline now seemed fragile, a patchwork of survival. The crops that had survived the storm were weak, their growth stunted by the ferocity of the wind and rain. The leeks, though still standing, were bent at awkward angles. The salsify, the skirret, so much of it had been lost, washed away by the flood of rainwater that had swept through the land. But despite the damage, despite the loss, there was still something to work with. They weren't starting from nothing. They were starting from a place of resilience, from a family who knew how to fight, to adapt, to survive. Osrich stood in the garden early one morning, staring out over the land, his hands on his hips. The sun had barely risen, casting long shadows across the muddy earth. The damage was still obvious. Broken plants, flattened crops, the earth scarred from the storm's rage. Yet, in the midst of all the destruction, there were signs of life. The leeks, though bent, had stubbornly pushed their way up through the soil, reaching for the sun. The skirret, though damaged, had started to show tiny shoots of new growth. It wasn't much, but it was something. And for Osrich, that was enough. Elswith joined him at the edge of the garden, her hands calloused from days of digging, planting, and fixing. She looked out over the land with a quiet understanding in her eyes. She had seen many storms, many seasons, but this one had been different. The land had been tested in ways it hadn't been before. The storms were stronger, more unpredictable. The world seemed to be shifting in ways they couldn't control. Yet, here they were, standing together, rebuilding what had been broken. They had been through the worst, and now they had to fight to make it through the rest. We'll have to start over with some of the crops, Elswith said, her voice low but steady. The soil's good, but it's going to take time to recover. Osrich nodded, his eyes scanning the garden. It always does. It's just, this time, it feels like we're running out of time. Elswith placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch firm but reassuring. We've made it through worse, Osrich. We always do. The storm was bad, but we've still got each other, and we've got the land. We'll rebuild. He sighed, looking down at the soil beneath his feet. I know. It's just everything feels different now. The land, the weather, it's not like it used to be. Elswith didn't argue. She understood the fear that lay beneath his words. The uncertainty that had crept into his demeanor was the same uncertainty that had been gnawing at her own. The storms were getting worse, the seasons were shifting. It wasn't just the garden that was at risk. It was everything. The earth, the food, the way of life they had always known. They couldn't control the weather. They couldn't control the changes that were happening around them, but they could control how they responded. And they would respond the only way they knew how, with hard work, with resilience, and with each other. Hiloa stepped into the garden, her hands still dirty from the morning's work. She'd been planting new seeds in the spaces where the storm had taken everything. Her face was streaked with dirt, but there was a determination in her eyes that mirrored her parents' own. She hadn't said much since the storm. She hadn't needed to. Her actions spoke louder than words ever could. She had always been quiet, observant, but in this moment, she was resolute. She wasn't just planting seeds, she was planting hope. We're going to make it through this, right? Hiloa asked, her voice soft but filled with a quiet strength. Osric turned to look at his daughter, his heart swelling with pride. We will. We always do. Elswith smiled, though it was a tired smile, one that carried the weight of too many storms. You've got the strength to make it through, Hiloa. You always have. The three of them stood there for a moment, taking in the state of the garden, the mess of broken plants and scattered crops, but in the midst of all the destruction, there was something else. Something that couldn't be destroyed. The land had been battered, but it wasn't dead. The plants had been uprooted, but they were still there, struggling to find their way back. And as long as they had the land, as long as they had each other, there was still hope. Let's get to work, Osric said, his voice firm. We've got a lot to do. And so they did. They worked together, side by side, planting new seeds in the places where the storm had destroyed the crops. They dug into the soil, turning it, enriching it, giving it the care it needed to heal. There was no magic to it, no shortcuts, just hard work, sweat, and time. As the days passed, the garden slowly began to show signs of life again. The new plants they had seeded began to sprout, fragile little shoots that barely broke through the soil. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep going. The leeks, the skirret, and the salsify, all of them slowly began to recover. The earth was healing, just as they were. It wasn't going to be easy, it wasn't going to be quick, but they could see the progress, the small victories. One evening, as the family sat down to a modest dinner, soup made from what little they had left from the previous season, they shared a quiet meal together, the fire crackling softly in the background. There was a sense of peace in the room, though it was tempered by the knowledge that there was still much to be done. But in that moment, as they passed the bread and ate together, Osric allowed himself to feel something he hadn't in a long time: hope. The storms might keep coming. The seasons might keep shifting, but they would face it all, together. The land might be uncertain, but the one thing that was never uncertain was their family. And with that strength, they would make it through. They always did. After dinner, as they sat together by the fire, Osrich looked at Elswith and Hiloa, his heart full. We'll get through this, he said, his voice steady. We'll rebuild, and we'll be stronger for it. Elswith nodded, her eyes soft with love and understanding. We always are. And as they sat in the warmth of the firelight, with the storm outside beginning to die down, the family knew one thing for sure. Whatever came next, they would face it together, always. The garden, the storm, the changing seasons, they didn't stand a chance against them. The weeks after the storm were a mixture of hard work and quiet reflection. The garden had started to show signs of recovery, though it was far from the thriving patch of crops they had once known. The leeks stood tall, but their leaves were still bent and scarred from the harsh winds. The salsify was growing, but in uneven patches, its roots twisted and reluctant. The skirret, once proud and abundant, had barely managed to push through the soil, its fragile shoots weak from the storm's brutality. Yet, despite it all, the garden had not given up. It was a slow process, an uncertain journey, but the land had a way of returning when given the chance. The plants were finding their footing, and so were they. Osrich, Elswith, and Hiloa worked together each day, the rhythm of their labor grounding them in a world that felt, at times, out of control. The storms had left their mark, but they were learning to move with the shifts in the land, learning to adapt to the changes they couldn't see coming. Every plant they saved, every row they replanted, was a small victory in a larger battle. But the uncertainty still lingered. Osrich felt it more than anyone, that quiet fear that gnawed at his thoughts. The storms, once occasional, had become more frequent. The seasons felt off balance, out of sync with the rhythms they had known. The garden was recovering, but would the next storm rip through it again? How many more seasons could they survive this new reality? "Do you think it'll hold?" Hiloa asked one evening, standing at the edge of the garden with her father. She had been working the soil for hours, her hands calloused, her body tired, but her gaze was sharp as it scanned the garden. Osric glanced over at her, his heart full of pride. She had grown so much over the years, learning from the land and from them. Yet, in that moment, he saw the same fear that had been plaguing him mirrored in her eyes. "I don't know," he said quietly, the weight of his uncertainty settling heavily in his chest. "But we can't give up. We've always found a way to make it through." Hiloa nodded, her eyes still fixed on the garden. The storm had shaken her, no doubt. She had seen the garden fall apart, the crops they had so carefully cultivated ripped away by nature's fury. But in the midst of that destruction, she had also learned something important: resilience. The plants, like them, had the strength to recover. They might never be the same, but they would endure. Elswith joined them, her voice steady as she spoke, though there was an edge of concern beneath her calm. "The garden is healing, but we need to think about the future. The storms are coming more often. We need to prepare for what's ahead, not just rebuild." Osric didn't answer immediately. He knew she was right. They had to be ready for what might come next. The storm had been a wake-up call. The world was changing, the weather was changing, and they had to adapt, just like the garden was adapting, learning to grow in new ways in a world that felt increasingly unpredictable. "We'll start with what we can control," he said finally. "We'll build stronger, be smarter, and we'll make sure we have enough food to last if the storms keep coming." Elswith nodded, her eyes soft but resolute. She reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "Together we'll get through this. We always do." Hiloa, standing next to them, felt a wave of reassurance. It was true. They had always gotten through the hardest times together. The storm might have torn through their garden, but it hadn't taken their family. They were still here, still standing. The family worked tirelessly in the days that followed. They rebuilt their defenses, reinforcing the parts of the garden that were most vulnerable. They planted new crops, focusing on hardier plants that might survive the unpredictable weather. They rotated the soil, enriched it, and gave it the care it needed to heal. There was no quick fix, no simple solution, but the steady rhythm of their labor was enough to keep them moving forward. As they worked, Osrich found himself thinking more and more about what came next. The storm had brought a harsh reality into focus, but it was also a reminder of something they had known all along. Nothing in life was guaranteed. The weather, the seasons, the crops, they could be here one day and gone the next. But what truly mattered wasn't the land or the crops. It was the family. They had each other. And no storm, no matter how fierce, could take that away. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, casting a warm orange glow over the garden, the family gathered around the table for their evening meal. It was simple: vegetable soup, bread, and the last of the dried herbs from the previous season, but it felt like a feast. The warmth of the fire, the quiet comfort of their small home, and the familiarity of each other's company made the world outside seem far away. Hiloa, who had been quiet all day, finally spoke up. "We'll make it through, won't we?" she asked, her voice hesitant but full of determination. She wasn't just asking about the garden. She was asking about everything, the storms, the seasons, the changes. Osrich looked at her, a small smile tugging at his lips. "We will," he said, his voice steady. "We always do." Elswith, sitting across from him, met his gaze. "Together," she added softly. And in that moment, as they sat around the table, Osrich felt a sense of peace wash over him. The storm had tested them, but they had come through it stronger. They were not the same as they had been before, but they were still here. The world had changed, the storms had changed, but they had survived, and together, they would keep surviving. The future was uncertain, the land might be shifting, but as long as they had each other, they could face whatever came next. The garden, like the family, might never be the same, but it would always grow. Always. And that, he realized, was enough. The wind had changed. Not in the metaphorical, life is shifting kind of way. No, this was literal. The wind, once a gentle companion to the fields, now carried a chill that whispered of more than just the coming winter. It spoke of change, unsettling, unrelenting change. Osrich stood at the edge of the garden, his eyes scanning the horizon. The sky, a tapestry of grays and muted blues, mirrored the uncertainty that had settled in his chest. The garden, their sanctuary, bore the scars of the recent storm. Bent stalks, uprooted herbs, and the lingering scent of damp earth told a story of resilience tested. Beside him, Hiloa adjusted the shawl around her shoulders. "The leeks are holding on," she murmured, more to herself than to her father. He nodded, his gaze fixed on a distant point. "They're fighters like us." But even as he spoke, Osrich couldn't shake the feeling that their fight was becoming more uphill with each passing season. The storm had been fiercer than any in recent memory, and the recovery, though steady, felt like a race against an unseen adversary. Elswith joined them, a basket of freshly picked herbs in her hands. "We need to consider diversifying our crops," she said, placing the basket down. "The weather patterns are changing. What thrived before may not survive the next storm." Osrich sighed, the weight of responsibility pressing heavily on his shoulders. "We've always relied on the land's consistency. If that's gone..." "Then we adapt," Elswith interrupted gently, "just as our ancestors did." Hiloa looked between her parents, determination flickering in her eyes. "I've been reading about the old ways, the open field system, crop rotations. Maybe there's wisdom there we've overlooked." Osrich raised an eyebrow. "The methods of our forebears?" She nodded. "They faced challenges too. Famine, floods, unpredictable climates. Yet they found ways to endure." Elswith smiled, pride evident in her expression. "Then perhaps it's time we revisit those lessons." The days that followed were filled with research and experimentation. Hiloa delved into ancient texts, uncovering practices long forgotten. She learned of the three-field system where land was divided into sections, one for winter crops, one for spring, and one left fallow to recover. This rotation not only preserved soil fertility but also reduced the risk of total crop failure. Osrich, initially skeptical, found himself intrigued. The idea of rotating crops, of allowing the land to breathe and rejuvenate, resonated with him. He recalled tales from his grandfather about communal farming, where villages worked together, sharing resources and knowledge. Elswith, ever the herbalist, explored the benefits of companion planting. She discovered that certain herbs, when planted alongside vegetables, could deter pests and enhance growth. Basil near tomatoes, garlic among carrots, simple strategies that could yield significant results. Together, the family began to implement these practices. They divided their land, planned rotations, and introduced new crops suited to the changing climate. They built raised beds to combat flooding and constructed windbreaks using native shrubs. The community took notice. Neighbors, initially wary, observed the family's efforts with curiosity. When Osrich shared his surplus of resilient barley with a struggling farmer, word spread. Soon, others sought advice, eager to learn and adapt. The village transformed. Fields once uniform now showcased a mosaic of crops. Knowledge flowed freely, and a spirit of collaboration took root. The collective resilience of the community grew, anchored by shared purpose and mutual support. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden hue over the revitalized fields, Osrich stood with his family surveying the fruits of their labor. "We've come a long way," he mused. Hiloa smiled, her hands stained with soil, "and we have further to go." Elswith placed a hand on his arm. "But together, we'll face whatever comes." The wind rustled the leaves, carrying with it a sense of hope. The land, though changed, was still theirs to nurture. And as the stars emerged, twinkling above, the family knew that while the future held uncertainties, their unity would be the constant guiding them forward. The weeks following the storm were filled with a quiet determination. The garden had started to show signs of recovery, though it was far from the thriving patch of crops they had once known. The leeks stood tall, but their leaves were still bent and scarred from the harsh winds. The salsify was growing, but in uneven patches, its roots twisted and reluctant. The skirret, once proud and abundant, had barely managed to push through the soil, its fragile shoots weak from the storm's brutality. Yet, despite it all, the garden had not given up. It was a slow process, an uncertain journey, but the land had a way of returning when given the chance. The plants were finding their footing, and so were they. Osrich, Elswith, and Hiloa worked together each day, the rhythm of their labor grounding them in a world that felt at times out of control. The storms had left their mark, but they were learning to move with the shifts in the land, learning to adapt to the changes they couldn't see coming. Every plant they saved, every row they replanted was a small victory in a larger battle, but the uncertainty still lingered. Osrich felt it more than anyone, that quiet fear that gnawed at his thoughts. The storms, once occasional, had become more frequent. The seasons felt off balance, out of sync with the rhythms they had known. The garden was recovering, but would the next storm rip through it again? How many more seasons could they survive this new reality? "Do you think it'll hold?" Hiloa asked one evening, standing at the edge of the garden with her father. She had been working the soil for hours, her hands calloused, her body tired, but her gaze was sharp as it scanned the garden. Osric glanced over at her, his heart full of pride. She had grown so much over the years, learning from the land and from them. Yet, in that moment, he saw the same fear that had been plaguing him mirrored in her eyes. "I don't know. I don't know," he said quietly, the weight of his uncertainty settling heavily in his chest. "But we can't give up. We've always found a way to make it through." Hiloa nodded, her eyes still fixed on the garden. The storm had shaken her, no doubt. She had seen the garden fall apart, the crops they had so carefully cultivated ripped away by nature's fury. But in the midst of that destruction, she had also learned something important: resilience. The plants, like them, had the strength to recover. They might never be the same, but they would endure. Elswith joined them, her voice steady as she spoke, though there was an edge of concern beneath her calm. "The garden is healing, but we need to think about the future. The storms are coming more often. We need to prepare for what's ahead, not just rebuild." Osric didn't answer immediately. He knew she was right. They had to be ready for what might come next. The storm had been a wake-up call. The world was changing, the weather was changing, and they had to adapt, just like the garden was adapting, learning to grow in new ways in a world that felt increasingly unpredictable. "We'll start with what we can control," he said finally. "We'll build stronger, be smarter, and we'll make sure we have enough food to last if the storms keep coming." Elswith nodded, her eyes soft but resolute. She reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "Together we'll get through this. We always do." Hiloa, standing next to them, felt a wave of reassurance. It was true. They had always gotten through the hardest times together. The storm might have torn through their garden, but it hadn't taken their family. They were still here, still standing. The family worked tirelessly in the days that followed. They rebuilt their defenses, reinforcing the parts of the garden that were most vulnerable. They planted new crops, focusing on hardier plants that might survive the unpredictable weather. They rotated the soil, enriched it, and gave it the care it needed to heal. There was no quick fix, no simple solution, but the steady rhythm of their labor was enough to keep them moving forward. As they worked, Osrich found himself thinking more and more about what came next. The storm had brought a harsh reality into focus, but it was also a reminder of something they had known all along. Nothing in life was guaranteed. The weather, the seasons, the crops, they could be here one day and gone the next. But what truly mattered wasn't the land or the crops. It was the family. They had each other. And no storm, no matter how fierce, could take that away. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, casting a warm orange glow over the garden, the family gathered around the table for their evening meal. It was simple: vegetable soup, bread, and the last of the dried herbs from the previous season, but it felt like a feast. The warmth of the fire, the quiet comfort of their small home, and the familiarity of each other's company made the world outside seem far away. Hiloa, who had been quiet all day, finally spoke up. "We'll make it through, won't we?" she asked, her voice hesitant but full of determination. She wasn't just asking about the garden, she was asking about everything: the storms, the seasons, the changes. Osrich looked at her, a small smile tugging at his lips. "We will," he said, his voice steady. "We always do." Elswith, sitting across from him, met his gaze. "Together," she added softly. And in that moment, as they sat around the table, Osrich felt a sense of peace wash over him. The storm had tested them, but they had come through it stronger. They were not the same as they had been before, but they were still here. The world had changed, the storms had changed, but they had survived, and together they would keep surviving. The future was uncertain, the land might be shifting, but as long as they had each other, they could face whatever came next. The garden, like the family, might never be the same, but it would always grow, always. And that, he realized, was enough. The morning after the storm was like the first breath after a long-held dive, heavy but filled with relief. The sky had cleared, leaving behind a tapestry of soft blues and faint streaks of orange as the sun began to rise. The land, though battered, stood resilient in the quiet aftermath. Osrich, Elswith, and Hiloa stood at the edge of the garden, surveying the damage with cautious optimism. The wind had settled, but the dampness still clung to everything. The garden, a patchwork of earth, plants, and rows of recovery, now bore the scars of the night's fury. There were still puddles pooling in the furrows where the soil had been disturbed, and the crops they had worked so hard to nurture were bent low, some of them flattened beyond repair. Yet, in between the broken stems, there were signs of life. A tiny shoot here, a leaf still clinging to a stalk there. The garden had endured, just like them. Osric ran a hand through his damp hair, his eyes scanning the rows. "The worst of it's over," he said quietly. His voice had the weight of a man who'd just spent the night bracing for something they couldn't control. It was still early, the sun barely above the horizon, but he already felt the exhaustion pulling at him. The storm had tested their limits, stretched them thin, but here they were, still standing. Elswith took a deep breath, her gaze following Osric's. She had always been the steady one, the calm in the storm. The garden had been her pride, her connection to the earth, and even now, despite the devastation, she knew they would rebuild. But her heart felt heavy with the realization that no matter how much they tried to plan, nature would always have the final say. "I think we need to work quickly," she said, breaking the silence. "The soil's still wet from the rain, and there's a lot to do." Osrich nodded, feeling the familiar pull of responsibility settle on his shoulders. "We'll get started right away." Hiloa, who had been standing silently beside them, finally spoke. Her voice, though soft, held a quiet strength that both parents had come to admire. "We should take stock of what we've lost. We can't fix everything at once, but we can save what we can." Osrich turned to her, meeting her gaze. Her eyes, though tired, held an unspoken understanding. In the wake of the storm, the young woman had matured, her determination growing stronger with every challenge. She had always been quiet, reserved, but now she was becoming the kind of person who found the strength to rebuild even in the most uncertain of times. "You're right," he said. "We'll prioritize the most important things first." Elswith stepped forward, already starting to gather up the tools they would need for the day. She moved with purpose, her mind working through the logistics of what needed to be done. "We'll start with the crops that can still be salvaged," she said. "The leeks, the skirret. We need to replant what we can and prepare for the next season." They worked in silence for the next few hours, the rhythmic sound of shovels digging into the damp earth punctuated only by the occasional murmur of the wind. The rain had passed, but the air still held the dampness of the storm, making the soil cling to everything, from their clothes to their boots. As they worked, the sun rose higher in the sky, casting a golden light over the garden. The first signs of growth were visible again, though it was still early. The patches that had been hardest hit, where the storm had torn through like a freight train, still looked like war zones. The crops had been uprooted, scattered by the ferocity of the winds. But life, as it always did, had found a way. Even in the destruction, there was potential. It was just hidden beneath the surface. Around noon, the family took a break, sitting under the makeshift shelter they'd put together to shield from the worst of the storm. The simple meal they shared, bread, some leftover stew, and a few herbs, was comforting despite the chaos around them. The garden, their hard work, and the years of building up what they had now felt fragile, almost breakable in the light of what had just happened. But Hiloa, always one to observe before speaking, broke the silence. What if the storms keep coming? What if we can't keep up with this? Osrich looked at her, his face softening. It wasn't a question he hadn't thought of, but hearing it from her felt like a weight he hadn't been ready to bear. The storm had made it clear that the land, the very thing they had always relied on, was changing. The weather wasn't as predictable. The seasons didn't behave the way they used to. Nothing felt certain anymore. "I don't know," he said quietly, meeting her gaze. "I wish I had an answer. But what I do know is that we've always found a way. We've always rebuilt, no matter what." Elswith nodded, her expression firm but tired. "The land changes, the seasons shift, but we have each other, and that's the one thing that's never changed." Hiloa nodded slowly, though she could see the uncertainty in her father's eyes. They had all felt it. The way the earth didn't feel as dependable anymore, the way the weather had turned on them. But like her mother had said, they had always found a way. It was just that the fight felt a little harder now, a little more uncertain. After their break, they returned to the work. The soil was still too wet to plant many new crops, but they began repairing the damage that was visible. Osric worked on reinforcing the windbreaks, ensuring the next storm wouldn't tear through their crops as easily. Elswith focused on salvaging what herbs and plants remained, tying them up, offering them extra support. Hiloa moved between them, carrying tools, assisting with what she could. The work was hard, but it was familiar. There was comfort in the rhythm of it. As the day wore on, the family had made significant progress. The garden wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was still theirs. They hadn't lost everything. And that, Osrich thought as he wiped the sweat from his brow, was enough. They weren't out of the woods yet. The storm had proven that. But they had each other. They had the land, and that was enough to keep going. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the garden, and the family gathered together once more, the work for the day done. The garden wasn't perfect, but it would heal. The earth would always heal. "We'll be okay," Osrich said, more to himself than anyone else. The words had the ring of quiet certainty, despite the fear that still lingered in the back of his mind. Elswith smiled, the lines of worry on her face softening. "We always are." And in the fading light of the evening, as the stars began to appear overhead, Osrich looked at his family, his wife, his daughter, and felt something that had been missing for days: peace. No matter how many storms came, no matter what challenges they faced, they would face them together, and that, in the end, was enough. The weeks that followed the storm were filled with quiet recovery. The garden, though far from where it had once been, had begun to show signs of life. Each day, Osric, Elswith, and Hiloa worked tirelessly, rebuilding what had been lost and caring for what had survived. The land was not as it had been. There was a certain roughness to the soil now, a new texture that told the story of the storm's rage. But it was still theirs, and that, for now, was enough. Osrich stood at the edge of the garden one morning, his boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. The air was thick with the scent of fresh rain, and the sky above was clear, the sun slowly making its way across the sky. It had been a few weeks since the storm, and the damage was still evident, though the small shoots of growth poking through the soil reminded him that life always found a way. Still, there was an unease that lingered deep in his chest. The storm hadn't just taken from them, it had shown them how fragile everything was. The garden, the land, the cycles they had relied on for so long, they weren't as predictable as they once seemed. Elswith joined him, a basket of herbs in her hands. She moved gracefully despite the fatigue that seemed to weigh on her bones. The lines of worry still showed in her face, but there was something else there too: determination. The storm had tested them, yes, but it hadn't broken them, and she wouldn't let it. "The garden's coming back," she said, her voice steady but with a hint of exhaustion. It's not perfect, but it's holding on. Osrich nodded, his gaze scanning the rows of leeks and skirret. It'll take time, but we've got it. We've made it through worse. Elswith paused, her eyes meeting his. She knew what he wasn't saying, the uncertainty that had begun to settle in his chest. The weather had become unpredictable. The seasons were shifting in ways they didn't fully understand, and no amount of preparation seemed to guarantee safety anymore. There was a quiet fear in him, a fear she shared, that no matter how hard they worked, they might not always be enough to protect what they had built. "We'll adapt," she said, her voice filled with quiet strength. "We've always found a way." But the truth was, Osrich wasn't sure. They had always rebuilt, always moved forward, but there was something different now. The land was changing, and no matter how much they worked, there was no guarantee that it would be enough. His mind kept returning to the same question. How long could they keep this up? "We can't stop," he said quietly, as if to reassure himself as much as Elswith. "We keep going, no matter what." The words sounded hollow even to him. The weight of responsibility felt heavier than it ever had before. There was so much to protect: his family, the garden, the land they had worked for years. But what if it all wasn't enough? What if the storms kept coming, stronger and stronger, until one day they couldn't rebuild anymore? Elswith placed a hand on his shoulder, her fingers warm against the chill of his skin. "We'll always find a way, Osrich," she said softly, "even when it seems like the world's against us." They stood together for a while, watching the garden slowly come to life again, the quiet hum of nature returning after the storm. The leeks had begun to straighten up again, the salsify's leaves were starting to stretch toward the sun, and the skirret, though still fragile, had new shoots of green breaking through the soil. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep going, enough to show them that nature was still capable of finding a way through the most difficult of times. "We can't predict what comes next," Osrich said after a long pause, his voice softer now, "but we can keep working." Elswith smiled at him, her eyes full of understanding. "Yes, we can." Later that day, Hiloa came into the garden, her hands still covered in dirt from her work with the plants. She had spent most of the morning working alone, digging new trenches for irrigation, checking on the herbs, and adding compost to the soil. She was no longer the quiet girl who had been so uncertain about the world around her. The storm had forced her to grow up faster than she'd expected, but she had found strength in it, just like her parents. "How's everything looking?" Osrich asked her, his eyes scanning the rows of newly planted herbs. "Better," she replied with a faint smile. "The soil's finally starting to settle. The plants are growing stronger now. They'll be ready for the next season." Osrich nodded, but he could see the lingering doubt in her eyes, the same uncertainty he had been carrying for weeks. The storm had affected all of them, even if they didn't talk about it much. The land had been their constant, but now it felt like even that wasn't enough to guarantee their future. Elswith stepped closer to Hiloa, her voice soft but filled with reassurance. "The land will heal. We just have to keep doing what we know. We're not alone in this." Hiloa glanced between her parents, her expression thoughtful. She wasn't just talking about the garden anymore. She was talking about life, the uncertainty, the storms, the work ahead. "I know," she said quietly. "We'll be okay, won't we?" Elswith smiled, her hand gently resting on Hiloa's shoulder. "We always are." The family stood together for a moment, taking in the garden, the quiet hum of life returning, and the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. Despite the uncertainty, despite the fear of what was to come, there was something enduring about their connection to the land and to each other. "We'll keep going," Osrich said finally, the weight in his chest lifting just a little. "We'll rebuild, one step at a time." They didn't know what the future held, and the storms might keep coming. But as long as they had each other, as long as they had the strength to keep working, they would face it together. The garden, like them, would heal, and they would find their way through the changing seasons, just as they always had. Together. The weeks that followed the storm were filled with quiet recovery. The garden, though far from where it had once been, had begun to show signs of life. Each day, Osrich, Elswith, and Hiloa worked tirelessly, rebuilding what had been lost and caring for what had survived. The land was not as it had been. There was a certain roughness to the soil now, a new texture that told the story of the storm's rage. but it was still theirs. And that, for now, was enough. Osrich stood at the edge of the garden one morning, his boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. The air was thick with the scent of fresh rain, and the sky above was clear, the sun slowly making its way across the sky. It had been a few weeks since the storm, and the damage was still evident, though the small shoots of growth poking through the soil reminded him that life always found a way. Still, there was an unease that lingered deep in his chest. The storm hadn't just taken from them, it had shown them how fragile everything was. The garden, the land, the cycles they had relied on for so long, they weren't as predictable as they once seemed. Elswith joined him, a basket of herbs in her hands. She moved gracefully despite the fatigue that seemed to weigh on her bones. The lines of worry still showed in her face, but there was something else there too. Determination. The storm had tested them, yes, but it hadn't broken them, and she wouldn't let it. "The garden's coming back," she said, her voice steady but with a hint of exhaustion. "It's not perfect, but it's holding on." Osric nodded, his gaze scanning the rows of leeks and skirret. "It'll take time, but we've got it. We've made it through worse." Elswith paused, her eyes meeting his. She knew what he wasn't saying, the uncertainty that had begun to settle in his chest. The weather had become unpredictable. The seasons were shifting in ways they didn't fully understand, and no amount of preparation seemed to guarantee safety anymore. There was a quiet fear in him, a fear she shared, that no matter how hard they worked, they might not always be enough to protect what they had built. "We'll adapt," she said, her voice filled with quiet strength. "We've always found a way." But the truth was, Osric wasn't sure. They had always rebuilt, always moved forward, but there was something different now. The land was changing, and no matter how much they worked, there was no guarantee that it would be enough. His mind kept returning to the same question. How long could they keep this up? "We can't stop," he said quietly, as if to reassure himself as much as Elswith. "We keep going, no matter what." The words sounded hollow even to him. The weight of responsibility felt heavier than it ever had before. There was so much to protect. His family, the garden, the land they had worked for years. But what if it all wasn't enough? What if the storms kept coming, stronger and stronger, until one day they couldn't rebuild anymore? Elswith placed a hand on his shoulder, her fingers warm against the chill of his skin. "We'll always find a way, Osrich," she said softly. "Even when it seems like the world's against us." They stood together for a while, watching the garden slowly come to life again, the quiet hum of nature returning after the storm. The leeks had begun to straighten up again, the salsify's leaves were starting to stretch toward the sun, and the skirret, though still fragile, had new shoots of green breaking through the soil. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep going, enough to show them that nature was still capable of finding a way through the most difficult of times. "We can't predict what comes next," Osric said after a long pause, his voice softer now. "But we can keep working." Elswith smiled at him, her eyes full of understanding. "Yes, we can." Later that day, Hiloa came into the garden, her hands still covered in dirt from her work with the plants. She had spent most of the morning working alone, digging new trenches for irrigation, checking on the herbs, and adding compost to the soil. She was no longer the quiet girl who had been so uncertain about the world around her. The storm had forced her to grow up faster than she'd expected, but she had found strength in it, just like her parents. "How's everything looking?" Osric asked her, his eyes scanning the rows of newly planted herbs. "Better," she replied with a faint smile. "The soil's finally starting to settle. The plants are growing stronger now. They'll be ready for the next season." Osrich nodded, but he could see the lingering doubt in her eyes, the same uncertainty he had been carrying for weeks. The storm had affected all of them, even if they didn't talk about it much. The land had been their constant, but now it felt like even that wasn't enough to guarantee their future. Elswith stepped closer to Hiloa, her voice soft but filled with reassurance. "The land will heal. We just have to keep doing what we know. We're not alone in this." Hiloa glanced between her parents, her expression thoughtful. She wasn't just talking about the garden anymore. She was talking about life, the uncertainty, the storms, the work ahead. "I know," she said quietly. "We'll be okay, won't we?" Elswith smiled, her hand gently resting on Hiloa's shoulder. We always are. The family stood together for a moment, taking in the garden, the quiet hum of life returning, and the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. Despite the uncertainty, despite the fear of what was to come, there was something enduring about their connection to the land and to each other. We'll keep going, Osric said finally, the weight in his chest lifting just a little. We'll rebuild, one step at a time. They didn't know what the future held, and the storms might keep coming. But as long as they had each other, as long as they had the strength to keep working, they would face it together. The garden, like them, would heal, and they would find their way through the changing seasons just as they always had, together. The season was slowly drawing to a close, but the air was still thick with the weight of uncertainty. Though the garden had shown signs of recovery after the storm, the constant ebb and flow of nature seemed more unpredictable than ever. Osric, Elswith, and Hiloa had done everything they could to protect the garden, to ensure that the plants they had painstakingly nurtured would survive. Yet every day the questions lingered. Would it be enough? Would the land continue to provide? Or would the storms become too frequent, too powerful? One morning, as the first light of dawn painted the sky with soft pinks and oranges, Osric found himself standing at the edge of the garden, watching the sun break through the clouds. The fields, though scarred from the storm, seemed to hold on to a quiet strength. The leeks were bending low but still alive. The salsify and skirret had managed to stay upright, and there were new shoots of herbs growing where there had once been nothing but bare soil. The storm had taken much, but it had also shown them how far they had come. Their ability to adapt, to rebuild, to keep pushing forward, those were the things that defined them. Yet even with all the effort, there was still that unshakable feeling of something being out of their control. The weather had become a stranger to them, no longer predictable in the way it once was. Elswith came up beside him, her hands still stained with soil from the work they had done the day before. It's not perfect, she said, her voice steady but tired, but it's ours, and it's enough for now. Osric turned to her, his face creased with the weight of the thought he couldn't shake. I know. But do you ever wonder if we're just holding on by a thread? What if the storms keep coming stronger each time? Elswith glanced over at the garden, her eyes scanning the plants that were still clinging to life. She knew what Osric meant. They had done everything they could, fortified the garden, introduced new planting methods, worked with the land in ways their ancestors had, and yet there was no guarantee. The storms were more frequent, the land more volatile, and it felt as if the earth itself was shifting beneath their feet. We can't control the storms, Osric, Elswith said, her voice soft but firm. But we can keep going. We can keep working, keep learning, keep planting. We've survived worse, and we'll survive whatever comes next. Osric nodded slowly, though the unease still lingered. He had always been the one to keep going, the one who made decisions, who took charge. But lately, he had begun to question whether they could keep this up. The garden was theirs, but the world was changing in ways they didn't understand. I just want to make sure we're doing enough, he said quietly, almost to himself. For Hiloa, for the future. Elswith placed a hand on his arm, a comforting touch that reminded him they were in this together. We're doing everything we can, and so is she. Hiloa appeared at the edge of the garden, her face bright with the kind of determination that had been growing in her over the past few weeks. She had spent long hours out there, planting, tending, and learning the ways of the land. She had always been quiet, but the storm had forced her to step up, to find her place in this ever-changing world. And now there was a quiet strength in her that Osric couldn't help but admire. How are the new seeds doing? Elswith asked, her voice full of curiosity. They're sprouting, Hiloa said, her eyes gleaming with pride. The peas and beans are doing well, and the carrots, though they're slow, are starting to grow. Osric smiled, his chest swelling with a quiet pride. He had watched his daughter grow from a quiet, uncertain girl into a young woman who had learned to face the unknown with courage. She had faced the storm with a strength he hadn't expected, and now she was leading the charge to rebuild the garden. You're doing great, he said, his voice warm with approval. Hiloa's smile was small but filled with pride. We all are, she said. This garden, it's not just about the plants, is it? It's about what we're building together. Elswith nodded, her eyes soft. Exactly. It's about the land, the work, and most of all, it's about us. The storms, the weather, they can change all they want. But as long as we have each other, we'll keep going. They stood there together for a moment, looking out over the garden. The storm had come, it had left its mark, but it had not broken them. It had tested their strength, yes, but it had also shown them something deeper, something that couldn't be washed away by rain or wind, their resilience. Osrich felt the weight on his chest lift, just a little. The uncertainty was still there, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts, but he realized that, for now, they were enough. They had always made it through, and they would continue to make it through, no matter what the future held. The storms would come, that was certain, but so would the sun. We'll keep working, Osrich said, his voice firm, filled with newfound resolve. We'll rebuild, we'll adapt, and we'll do it together. Elswith smiled, her heart swelling with pride for both her husband and their daughter. Together, she echoed. And with that, the family returned to their work, their hands in the soil, their hearts beating to the rhythm of the land. The future was uncertain, but as long as they had each other, they knew they would face whatever came next. The garden, though scarred, would continue to grow. And so would they. The days had grown shorter, and the harvest season was creeping closer. Osrich, Elswith, and Halloa had worked tirelessly through the warmer days, preparing the garden for the coming months. The garden, though still recovering from the storm's destructive power, had shown resilience. The plants, though not as lush as in previous years, were beginning to produce again. The leeks were ripe for picking, and the skirret had recovered enough to be dug up. The herbs, now well established, stood tall, their fragrances filling the air as the morning dew slowly evaporated. But despite the quiet progress, there was an unease that hung in the air. It wasn't about the work they had done or the crops they had saved. It was about the future. The weather had been unpredictable, the storms had become more intense, and the land, though still alive, seemed to be pushing back in its own subtle way. Osrich couldn't shake the feeling that they were barely keeping up, always on the edge of the unknown. One evening, as the last light of day faded and the temperature dropped, the family gathered around the fire in the small cabin. The crackling flames cast flickering shadows across their faces as they ate a simple meal. Soup, made from the vegetables that had survived the storm, bread from the previous harvest, and some fresh herbs Elth had gathered from the garden. Osrich sat back, his bowl empty but his mind far from satisfied. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice quiet, as though testing the weight of the words before they left his mouth. "What if we're not doing enough? What if these storms just keep coming and the land, it's not enough to keep up with them?" Elswith looked at him over the rim of her bowl, her expression calm but knowing. "You're not alone in that worry," she said softly. "I've been thinking the same, but we can't let the storms, literal or figurative, define us. We do what we can. We prepare for what's next. We rebuild. We adapt." Halloa, who had been silent up until that point, looked up from her hands where she had been nervously toying with the edge of her sleeve. "We've done so much already," she said, her voice thoughtful but firm. "And we're learning new things each day. We're better prepared now than we've ever been. The land's tough. It's not just about surviving, it's about learning how to live with it, how to change with it." Osrich felt the weight of his daughter's words sink into his chest. She had grown into someone who understood what it meant to struggle, to face the unknown head-on, and yet still move forward. Her quiet determination reminded him of why they had to keep going. Even when the uncertainty threatened to overwhelm them, they had to keep fighting, not just for themselves, but for each other. "Maybe you're right," Osrich said, the unease still there, but softened by the warmth of the fire and the family around him. "Maybe it's not about trying to control everything, but about learning to live with it. The storms, the changes, we'll figure it out." Elswith smiled at him, the lines of worry around her eyes softening. "We will. We always do. And we've learned from the past. We know the land. We've seen how it recovers. It's a fight, yes, but it's a fight we've always been able to win." They fell into a comfortable silence, the fire crackling in front of them, the only sound in the cabin. Osrich watched the flames flicker, the orange glow dancing across the wood and metal. There was something soothing about the fire, something grounding that allowed his thoughts to settle, if only for a moment. He didn't have all the answers, and neither did Elswith or Hiloa, but he knew one thing. They couldn't stop. The storms would keep coming. The seasons would keep changing. The land would keep testing them. But as long as they had each other, they could face whatever came their way. They had been tested before. The storm had been a reminder that nothing was permanent, that they couldn't take anything for granted. But it had also reminded them that together, they could rebuild. They could adapt. They could grow. Osrich stood, stretching his stiff limbs, and looked out the window. The night had settled in, and the stars hung high above, pinpricks of light against the dark sky. The garden was quiet now, resting in the calm of the evening, but there was an energy to it, a promise that the land would always be there. They would continue to nurture it, to fight for it, and in return, it would fight for them. "We'll face what comes next," Osrich said, his voice steady, a sense of resolve building within him. "Together. We always do." Hiloa smiled, her expression full of quiet understanding. "Together," she echoed, looking at her parents with the strength of someone who had already faced the storm and come out stronger for it. Elswith stood and moved toward the door, glancing back at Osrich and Hiloa. "The garden can wait until tomorrow," she said with a warm smile. "For now, let's enjoy the peace we've earned." Osrich smiled, nodding in agreement. The road ahead would be uncertain, and the storms would continue to come. But for now, there was peace in their hearts, and that was enough. They would continue to rebuild, to adapt, to live with the land as it changed. And in the end, that was all they could ask for. As the fire crackled and the stars twinkled outside, the family gathered closer, content in the quiet strength they had built together. The future was unknown, but one thing was certain. They would face it, not alone, but together. Always. The days had grown colder, and the first hint of frost hung in the air like an unwelcome guest. The once bustling garden, now showing signs of wear from the season's hardships, was quieter, its soil still damp and heavier than usual. The leaves of the leeks and skirret were now tinged with the cool breath of fall, their green shades fading into deeper hues of yellow and brown. Osrich, Elswith, and Hiloa had been working harder than ever to prepare for the approaching winter, knowing the garden's resilience would be tested once more. But the chill in the air wasn't just the sign of the changing season. It was also the unease that seemed to settle deeper within them all. The uncertainty, always a distant whisper, now felt louder than ever. The land, which had always given so much, seemed less yielding, as though it, too, was exhausted by the constant cycle of destruction and renewal. Each storm, each unexpected shift in the weather, had left its mark, and no matter how much they worked, there was always the looming question of whether it would be enough. Would the land continue to provide? Or were they nearing the end of something? Something they couldn't quite define, but could feel nonetheless. Osrich stood near the edge of the garden, his hands tucked into the deep pockets of his worn coat. The sky above was overcast, and the wind, though not as harsh as it had been in previous months, carried a biting edge. The leaves rustled softly in the trees, and the distant sound of a bird calling broke the silence. Yet, despite the beauty of the landscape, there was a quiet dread creeping into his heart. Elswith joined him silently, her presence as steady as the ground beneath them. She didn't need to ask what was on his mind. She had been feeling it too, the weight of uncertainty. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, her voice carrying the gentleness that had always been her strength. Osrich didn't immediately answer, his gaze still fixed on the garden, his mind racing through the same questions. "I'm just wondering how much longer we can do this," he said finally, his voice thick with worry. "The storms, they're coming more often, and I don't know if we can keep up." Elswith paused, looking out over the garden, taking in the weathered earth and the bent plants. She could feel the unease too, that same nagging doubt that had followed them since the storm. "We've always adapted, Osrich," she said quietly, her hand brushing against his arm. "Every storm that's come our way, we've rebuilt. We've found a way. This is no different." He shook his head, a faint, weary smile crossing his face. "I want to believe that," he admitted, "but Sometimes it feels like we're fighting against something we can't change. The weather's not the same, the land's not the same. How much more can we give before we run out of fight? Elswith remained silent, knowing that no amount of reassurance could make the weight of his words disappear. She knew what he was feeling, the deep fear that the land that had once sustained them might no longer be enough. She had felt it herself, but in that silence she also knew something that neither of them had been willing to say aloud. They weren't just fighting for the crops, for the garden. They were fighting for each other, for the future they still believed in, no matter how uncertain it seemed. "We'll keep going," she said finally, her voice firm but not without a hint of exhaustion. "One step at a time, just like we've always done." Before Osrich could respond, Hiloa appeared from behind the house, carrying a bundle of dried herbs in her arms. She had been working on harvesting what was left of the herbs, knowing the frost would soon claim them. Her face, though tired, showed the determination that had grown in her since the storm. There was a quiet strength in her eyes now, a reflection of her understanding that no matter what came next, they would face it together. "How's the garden holding up?" she asked, her voice calm despite the uncertainty that had hung in the air all day. Osrich turned to her, offering a small smile. "It's getting there, slowly, but I'm worried that we're pushing the land too hard." Hiloa nodded, her gaze drifting toward the rows of plants. "It's been a rough season," she said thoughtfully, "but I think the land still has something left to give. We just need to find out what it is." Elswith placed a gentle hand on Hiloa's shoulder. "Exactly. We'll adapt. We'll find the right way, just like we always have." The three of them stood in silence for a moment, each one feeling the weight of the same thought. They couldn't keep this up forever. The seasons would continue to change, the storms would keep coming, and no matter how much they worked, they couldn't control the land or the weather. But what they could control was how they responded. They could keep planting, keep nurturing, and above all, keep each other close. Together, they had always found a way forward. Hiloa turned to her parents, a quiet resolve in her eyes. "We'll keep working. We'll make it through," she said, her voice strong. Osrich looked at her, pride swelling in his chest. He had watched her grow, seen her step up when the storm came, and now, in the quiet strength of her words, he saw the future. It might not be easy, but they would face it together, as they always had. The evening drew on, and the wind picked up slightly, the chill of the air making the first signs of winter feel real. But inside, around the fire, there was warmth. They were not alone in this fight. They had each other, and as long as that remained true, they could face whatever the future held. "We'll keep going," Osrich said again, his voice filled with a newfound certainty. "One season at a time, one storm at a time." Elswith nodded. "Together, always." And as they sat by the fire, the crackling warmth of the flames filling the room, the family knew that the future was uncertain. The storms would keep coming, and the land would continue to change. But they would always have each other, and that was enough. The garden might be scarred, but it was still theirs. And as long as they had the strength to keep working, they would find a way to make it through. Together. Always. The first heavy snowfall of the season arrived without warning, blanketing the land in a thick layer of white. The garden, once a patchwork of green and brown, was now reduced to soft, pristine drifts of snow, the once bustling rows of leeks and skirret buried beneath the cold. Osrich stood by the window, staring out into the quiet, the chill of the room, a stark contrast to the warmth of the fire crackling behind him. It had come faster than they had expected, this early snow, and with it came a new kind of silence, a silence that felt both peaceful and ominous. Elswith moved beside him, her gaze following his out the window. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" she said, her voice soft. Osrich nodded, his eyes fixed on the endless stretch of white. "It is," he agreed, though there was a heaviness in his heart that made it difficult to fully embrace the peace. The garden, their livelihood, now lay dormant, resting under the weight of the snow. It was the first real rest they had had in months, yet it didn't feel like relief. It felt like a pause, a moment suspended between what had been and what was yet to come. The storm had changed so much. The work they had done to recover the garden had brought them some comfort, but the land was still uncertain. They could only do so much. The future felt fragile, as though the next season might not be as kind. And no matter how many crops they replanted or how many new methods they tried, there was no guarantee that the land would continue to give. Elswith placed a hand on his arm, her touch warm against the chill. "We've made it through storms before," she said, her voice steady, though he could hear the quiet resolve in it. "We've always found a way." "I know," Osrich murmured, his gaze still lost in the distance. "But every season feels like it's getting harder. I can't help but wonder how long we can keep this up." Elswith sighed, a sound that carried a quiet weight, and then moved closer to him. "The land doesn't just take from us, Osrich. It also gives. And we've seen it time and time again. After every storm, the earth comes back. We come back. It might not be easy, but it's worth it." "I just wish I could be sure," he said, his voice thick with the uncertainty he had been carrying for weeks now. "I don't want to keep rebuilding only to see it all washed away again." Elswith's hand tightened on his arm, offering him the steady comfort he had grown used to over the years. "You don't have to be sure," she said softly. "You just have to keep going. We've always kept going." Osrich turned toward her then, his eyes meeting hers. He could see the strength in her, the unwavering belief that they could weather whatever came their way. It was a belief that had carried them through so many trials before, and in this moment, he found himself drawing strength from her as well. The storms, the changing seasons, the uncertainty, it was all part of the journey, and they would face it together. There was no way to predict what the future held, but as long as they had each other, they could endure. Hiloa appeared at the door then, her face bright with the warmth of the fire and the excitement of a new task. "I finished checking the roof," she said, stepping into the room. "We're good. Nothing's leaking. I think the house will hold through the winter." Osrich smiled at her, his heart swelling with pride. She had grown so much, learning the ways of the land, of survival, and of resilience. She wasn't the same girl who had been unsure of the world just a season ago. Now she was taking charge, taking responsibility in ways that were far beyond her years. "That's good news," Osrich said, his voice full of pride. "You've done well, Hiloa." Hiloa smiled back, her eyes reflecting a quiet strength that seemed to mirror both her parents. "We'll make it through," she said, her voice full of conviction. "We always do." Elswith nodded, moving over to her daughter and pulling her into a gentle embrace. "Yes, we will, together." They stood there for a long moment, the warmth of the fire wrapping around them, the snow outside a quiet reminder of the season that had passed and the one that would come. The world was changing, they knew that. The storms were unpredictable, the seasons felt shorter, and the land was less forgiving than it used to be. But they were still here, and together they would face whatever came next. "I guess we'll just have to keep planting," Osrich said after a long pause. The weight of his earlier doubts lifted slightly by the warmth of the fire and his family around him. Elswith smiled, her eyes soft with affection. "And we'll keep learning," she added. "We'll adapt. We always do." The room fell quiet again, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the soft howl of the wind outside. The snow had come and the garden had settled for its winter rest. But they were not done, not by a long shot. The seasons would continue to turn, the storms would keep coming, but as long as they had each other, they would endure. Together, they would face the future, one season at a time. And as the firelight flickered and the snow continued to fall gently outside, Osrich felt a quiet peace settle within him. No, they didn't have all the answers. The land would continue to test them, but they would face it together. They always had, and they always would. The days following the deep snowstorm were calm but heavy, the world wrapped in silence. The garden, buried beneath the thick layer of snow, seemed to sleep peacefully, its work done for the season. The cabin, filled with the warmth of the fire and the soft murmur of daily tasks, had become the center of their small world. But even within this quiet, the uncertainty lingered. The storm had done more than just cover the earth in snow. It had reminded them of how fragile everything was. Osrich sat by the window, staring out at the untouched landscape, his thoughts clouded with questions he didn't know how to answer. The land, which had always been his anchor, felt more distant now. He couldn't ignore the change in the weather, the unpredictable storms, the erratic seasons. How much longer could they keep rebuilding, keep pushing forward without knowing what might come next? Elswith joined him, her footsteps light as she moved to his side. She could feel the unease in the air, the weight that pressed on him even when he tried to hide it. "It's been a hard season," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "but we've survived." Osrich nodded, but the worry didn't leave his eyes. "I keep thinking about what's next," he said quietly. "The storms, they're getting worse. The seasons, everything feels different. How long can we keep up with this?" Elswith placed a hand on his shoulder, offering a warmth that reached far beyond the fire. "We don't know what the future holds, but we do know this: we've always found a way. The storms will come, the seasons will change, but as long as we have each other, we will keep going." Osrich met her gaze, his eyes searching for reassurance in hers. "I want to believe that," he said, his voice heavy with doubt. "But what if we don't have enough? What if the land can't give anymore?" Elswith didn't respond immediately. She simply squeezed his shoulder, the silence between them filled with understanding. She had felt the weight of his concerns too, the fear that the land might no longer be enough, the worry that their work would be in vain. But she also knew that in the face of all this uncertainty, there was one thing that would never change: their strength together. Just then, Hiloa entered the room, carrying a basket of dried herbs she had gathered earlier. Her face was flushed from the cold, but her eyes were calm, determined. She set the basket down on the table and looked at her parents. "Everything's holding up," she said, though her voice held the quiet weight of the same concern they all shared. "The firewood's ready, and we're prepared for the worst of the winter." Osrich nodded, feeling the pride swell in his chest. Hiloa had grown into someone capable, someone who didn't shy away from the work that needed to be done. Her strength was something that both he and Elswith leaned on, even when the doubt crept in. "We'll make it through this," Hiloa continued, her voice soft but resolute. "We always do." Osrich looked at his daughter, a small smile tugging at his lips. She was right. The storms would keep coming, the seasons would shift, but they would find a way. They always did. The land might change, the world might become more unpredictable, but as long as they had each other, they would face whatever came next. Together. Always. "You're very welcome. It was a pleasure to share Osrich, Elswith, and Hiloa's journey with you. Their story is a beautiful reminder of resilience and the power of family, especially when faced with the unpredictable challenges of life. It's a journey of perseverance, growth, and the quiet strength we all carry, even when we feel uncertain. I completely agree that their journey resonates with the real-life struggles we all encounter, navigating through challenges, adapting to change, and finding hope even in the toughest moments. Their determination to face the storms and continue moving forward is something we can all draw inspiration from. What do you think about their story? Do you have any personal experiences that remind you of the themes of resilience and hope in the face of adversity? I'm so glad you enjoyed it. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you won't miss more stories like this. Your support and feedback really mean a lot. Until next time, take care and keep finding strength in the journey, no matter the storms ahead. See you soon.